Some sounds follow you home, even when they shouldn't exist. My name is Father McKenna, and I've been officiating funeral services for Riverside Memorial Home for the better part of 2 decades. In that time, I've blessed the departed through their final journey, more times than I can count. The ritual never changes: the same Latin prayers, the same gentle cadence, the same peaceful finality. What happened during Margaret Holloway's service in late October of 2023 changed all that. I'd known Mrs. Holloway peripherally through the parish. She was one of those quiet parishioners who attended Sunday Mass without fail, but rarely spoke beyond pleasantries. 78 years old, passed peacefully in her sleep, according to Director Hayes. Her family requested a traditional Catholic service. Nothing unusual. I prepared my standard readings, checked my notes for personal details to include in the homily, and arrived at Riverside that gray Thursday morning expecting routine solemnity. The viewing room was arranged perfectly. Mrs. Holloway lay in a simple oak casket, hands folded over a rosary, dressed in the navy dress her daughter had chosen. Her face held that serene expression we all hope for: peaceful, dignified, at rest. About 30 mourners filled the chairs, mostly elderly parishioners and a handful of family members. Everything felt appropriately somber as I began the opening prayers. It was during the blessing of the body that I first noticed something amiss. As I moved closer to the casket to sprinkle holy water and recite the final blessing, I could have sworn I saw Mrs. Holloway's eyelids flutter, just the slightest movement, barely perceptible. I paused mid-sentence, studying her face, but she remained perfectly still. Trick of the lighting, I told myself, and continued with the Latin prayer. In paradisum deducante angeli, I recited, asking the angels to lead her to paradise. That's when I saw it clearly. Her eyes opened. Not the glassy, lifeless stare you might expect from the deceased, but a focused, alert gaze that seemed to track my movements. Several mourners gasped, and I heard Mrs. Holloway's daughter sob from the front row. But what unsettled me most was the expression on Margaret's face. She looked attentive, as if she were listening intently to every word. I stumbled through the rest of the blessing, my voice losing its practiced smoothness. Mrs. Holloway's eyes remained open, following me as I moved around the casket. When I reached the final prayer, something impossible happened. Her lips began to move, forming words in perfect synchronization with my Latin recitation. Silent at first, but then I heard it a whispered echo of my own voice, speaking words she had never learned in life. Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine, I said, and her mouth shaped each syllable precisely. The mourners began to murmur among themselves, some crossing themselves repeatedly. Mrs. Holloway's daughter stood up, her face pale with shock. "Father, what's happening?" she asked, but I had no answer. The most disturbing moment came during the final commendation. As I spoke the words, "Go forth, Christian soul," Mrs. Holloway's lips moved with mine, but she was saying something different. I leaned closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to step back. Her whispered words were barely audible. "I'm not ready. I'm not ready. I'm not ready." The service ended in chaos. Family members rushed to the casket, some demanding explanations, others weeping uncontrollably. Director Hayes appeared at my elbow, his face grim. "We need to speak privately," he said, guiding me to his office, while his staff managed the crowd. In the quiet of his office, Hayes pulled up security footage from the chapel cameras. The timestamp showed the exact moment I had begun the final blessing. On screen, I could see myself standing beside the casket, speaking the Latin prayers. Mrs. Holloway's face was clearly visible in the frame. As the footage played, I watched her eyes open with that same alert awareness I had witnessed. But what made my blood run cold was watching her mouth move in perfect synchronization with my prayers. Prayers that were not audible on the recording, yet she seemed to know every word. "How is this possible?" I asked Hayes. He shook his head slowly. "In 30 years of funeral service, I've never seen anything like it. But there's something else you should know. He fast-forwarded to another timestamp. This was recorded 3 hours before the service, during final preparations. The footage showed Mrs. Holloway lying peacefully in her casket, hands folded, eyes closed. But every few minutes, her lips would move silently, as if she were practicing something. Haze enhanced the audio, and we could hear the faintest whisper of Latin words, fragments of funeral prayers, spoken with growing clarity. I drove home in silence that evening, my mind replaying every moment of the service. Mrs. Holloway had somehow been preparing for her own funeral mass, learning prayers she had never been taught. But the question that haunted me most was simpler. If she wasn't ready to go, what was keeping her tethered to that moment of blessing? The next morning, I received a call from Hayes. Mrs. Holloway's body had been found sitting upright in the casket when the morning staff arrived. Her hands were no longer folded in prayer, they were pressed together as if she had been clapping. On the pillow beside her head, someone had placed a small prayer card with the text of the funeral mass. None of the staff remembered putting it there. I never officiated another funeral at Riverside Memorial Home. Some claimed it was a miracle, others a sign of unfinished business in life. But I know what I witnessed in that chapel. Mrs. Holloway wasn't just reciting prayers, she was trying to tell me something. And every night since, just before I fall asleep, I hear her whispered words echoing in my memory. I'm not ready. The most unsettling part isn't what happened during the service. It's knowing that somewhere in the darkness between life and death, Margaret Holloway is still practicing those Latin prayers, waiting for a blessing that will finally let her go. Some graves don't want to stay where you put them. I'm Vincent Castellanos, and I've been maintaining the grounds at Oakwood Cemetery for 15 years. In that time, I've reset headstones shifted by frost heaves, replanted sections damaged by storms, and dealt with more unusual situations than most people would believe. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened with Father Morrison's burial site in the autumn of 2023. Father Morrison had been the rector at St. Catherine's for nearly 40 years before his passing. The whole community turned out for his burial, easily 200 people crowding around plot 47B in the clergy section. It was a beautiful October day, the kind where the maple trees drop their leaves like confetti, and the air holds just enough chill to remind you that winter's coming. The service went smoothly, and by evening, I'd finished the final grading around his headstone, a modest granite marker with his name, dates, and a simple cross. Everything seemed normal for the first few days after the burial. I made my usual morning rounds, checking for any overnight damage from raccoons or vandalism, ensuring the flowers were properly arranged. Plot 47B looked exactly as it should. Fresh earth settled neatly, temporary flowers from the service still holding their color, the headstone perfectly aligned with the others in that row. It was on the fourth morning that I noticed something odd. A thin line of fresh soil had been scattered in an arc about 2 feet to the left of Father Morrison's grave. Not much, just enough to catch my attention as I walked by. I figured it might be from a groundhog or some other burrowing animal, though it struck me as strange that the disturbance formed such a neat pattern. I swept it up with my rake and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, there was more dirt. This time, it formed a clear trail leading from the gravesite toward the chapel, maybe 8 feet long. The strange part was how uniform it looked, not random scattered earth, but almost like someone had carefully measured out handfuls of soil and placed them at regular intervals. I checked for footprints or tool marks, but the surrounding grass showed no signs of human activity. By the end of the first week, I started documenting what I was seeing. Each morning brought a new configuration of scattered soil, always originating from plot 47B. Sometimes it formed geometric patterns, crosses, circles, straight lines pointing toward different sections of the cemetery. Other times it spelled out partial letters, though never anything coherent enough to make sense of. The groundskeeping staff began to take notice. Maria, who handled the eastern sections, mentioned that she'd seen similar disturbances near other clergy graves. but nothing as consistent or deliberate. The real concern started when I noticed the headstone itself was moving. Just an inch or two at first, shifted slightly to the left from its original position. I reset it, making sure the foundation was solid, and documented the exact placement with measurements. The next morning, it had moved again. Same direction, same distance. By the end of the second week, Father Morrison's headstone had traveled nearly 6 feet from its original location, moving incrementally each night. I brought the situation to the attention of Marcus Webb, our cemetery supervisor. He suggested setting up a trail camera to capture whatever was causing the disturbances. We installed it 40 feet from the gravesite, angled to cover the entire plot and surrounding area. The first night's footage showed nothing unusual, just the normal progression of darkness to dawn, with the occasional rabbit or possum crossing the frame. But the headstone kept moving, and the soil patterns became more elaborate. They began to resemble maps or diagrams, with clear pathways connecting different sections of the cemetery. I started following these dirt trails during my rounds, and discovered they led to significant locations: the chapel, the maintenance building, the oldest section where the founding families were buried. It was as if someone was creating a guided tour of the cemetery's most important sites. The breakthrough came during the third week, when our security cameras captured something that changed everything. The footage showed the normal nighttime cemetery scene until approximately 3 in the morning. Then, barely visible in the infrared imaging, a figure appeared near plot 47B. It moved slowly, methodically, bending down to arrange something on the ground. The figure worked for nearly an hour, creating that night's soil pattern with deliberate precision. When Marcus and I reviewed the footage the next morning, we both reached the same impossible conclusion. The figure in the infrared recording matched Father Morrison's height and build exactly. The way it moved, the careful attention to detail, even the slight stoop he'd developed in his later years, everything matched the man we had buried 3 weeks earlier. We decided to confront the situation directly. That evening, I volunteered to spend the night in the cemetery, positioned where I could observe plot 47B directly. Marcus wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That a buried priest was rearranging his own gravesite? Instead, we agreed I would document whatever happened and we'd decide on next steps in the morning. I set up a folding chair behind a large oak tree about 50 feet from Father Morrison's grave and settled in for a long night. The hours passed slowly, marked by the distant sound of traffic and the occasional owl call. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the first sound, a soft scraping, like metal against stone. I focused my flashlight on plot 47B and saw the headstone shifting, moving in tiny increments toward its new position. But there was no one there. The headstone moved on its own, accompanied by that scraping sound, until it reached the exact spot where I'd found it that morning. Then came the soil. Handfuls of earth rose from the gravesite and arranged themselves in patterns around the headstone, forming what looked like a detailed map of the cemetery's layout. The whole process took about an hour, performed with an intelligence and purpose that couldn't be explained by natural causes. As dawn approached, I made my decision. Walking slowly toward plot 47B, I called out softly, "Father Morrison? If you're here, I need to understand what you're trying to tell us." The soil arrangement shifted, forming clear letters in the earth. "Find them." Then, more scattered dirt spelled out, coordinate section 12, row C, plots 15 through 18. These were unmarked graves in the oldest part of the cemetery, an area that had been abandoned for decades. The next day, our ground-penetrating radar confirmed what Father Morrison had been trying to communicate: 4 unmarked graves in the exact location indicated by his dirt patterns. Cemetery records showed they belonged to priests from the 1800s whose burial sites had been lost when the original chapel burned down. For over a century, their graves had gone untended and unremembered. We installed proper headstones for the forgotten priests and held a memorial service. After that, plot 47B remained undisturbed. Father Morrison's headstone stayed in place, and the mysterious soil patterns stopped appearing. But every morning when I pass that section, I can't shake the feeling that Father Morrison isn't resting. He's standing guard, making sure none of his fellow priests are ever forgotten again. Sometimes, just before dawn, I catch a glimpse of movement near those old graves, a tall figure checking on each marker before disappearing into the morning mist. Sometimes the mourners who matter most are the ones nobody else can see. My name is Director Hayes, and I've been managing memorial services at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 27 years. In that time, I've learned to read grief in all its forms, the quiet dignity of acceptance, the raw anguish of sudden loss, the complicated emotions that come with difficult relationships. What I thought I understood about mourning changed completely during Father Benedetti's viewing in November of 2023. Father Benedetti had served 3 parishes during his 42 years of ministry. He was particularly beloved at St. Mary's, where he'd spent his final 15 years before retirement. His passing at 81 was peaceful, a heart attack in his sleep, according to his physician. The family requested a 2-day viewing followed by a funeral mass at St. Mary's. Nothing unusual in the arrangements, though I did note the unusually large number of people expected to pay their respects. We prepared Father Benedetti in our largest viewing room, arranging the casket at the front with comfortable seating for about 60 people. The flowers were magnificent arrangements from every parish he'd served, plus dozens from individual parishioners. By the time we opened for the first viewing session at 2 o'clock that Thursday afternoon, a line had already formed outside our front door. The mourners came in steady waves throughout the day. Former parishioners, fellow clergy, community members whose lives he'd touched through decades of service. Each person signed our guest book and spent time at the casket, many sharing stories with family members about Father Benedetti's impact on their lives. The atmosphere was appropriately somber, but filled with genuine affection, exactly the kind of viewing that reminds you why this work matters. It was during the evening session that I first noticed her, an elderly woman in a black dress and veil, sitting in the back row of chairs. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair visible beneath the veil and hands that showed the careful movements of advanced age. What struck me as unusual was her stillness. While other mourners came and went, participated in conversations, or approached the casket, she simply sat and watched. For 3 hours, she maintained the same position, never speaking to anyone or signing the guest book. I approached her during a quiet moment, intending to offer assistance or simply acknowledge her presence. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Director Hayes. Is there anything I can do for you this evening?" She looked up at me with clear blue eyes that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. "I'm just paying my respects," she said softly. Anthony was a good man. The intimacy of using Father Benedetti's first name suggested a close relationship. But when I asked if she was family, she simply smiled and looked back toward the casket. The next morning, I reviewed our security camera footage from the previous evening, a routine practice to ensure our services run smoothly. The cameras cover every angle of our viewing rooms, providing clear documentation of each service. What I saw on that footage still unsettles me months later. The elderly woman in black appeared in every frame, exactly as I remembered her. She entered the viewing room at 6:15 p.m. and remained in the same seat until just before closing. But when I watched the segments showing other mourners interacting near her chair, something impossible became clear. People walked past her, sat in adjacent chairs, even placed flowers on the table directly in front of her position. None of them acknowledged her presence. More disturbing still, when I watched carefully, I could see mourners sitting in the exact chair she occupied, as if she weren't there at all. I fast-forwarded through the entire evening's footage, focusing specifically on the back row where she had sat. The woman remained visible throughout, but she cast no reflection in the mirror mounted on the wall behind the seating area. Every other person in the room appeared clearly in that mirror, but her chair appeared empty in the reflection, even while the camera showed her sitting there. The second day of viewing brought even more visitors, including several priests from the diocese and a contingent from the St. Mary's Parish Council. I found myself watching for the woman in black, both in person and through our security monitors. She arrived at the same time, 6:15 p.m., and took the same seat. This time, I decided to document her presence more carefully. I stationed myself where I could observe both the woman and the mirror behind her. The contradiction was exactly as I'd seen in the footage. She sat clearly visible in my direct line of sight, but the mirror showed only an empty chair. When I approached other mourners near her location and asked if they'd noticed the elderly woman, they looked confused. "Which woman?" was the consistent response. Several people were sitting in that exact area, but none of them saw her. The most unsettling moment came near the end of the second evening. Father Martinez from St. Mary's was saying goodbye to the Benedetti family when he paused mid-sentence, looking toward the back of the room. "Is that Eleanor?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion. The family followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "Eleanor Benedetti passed away 12 years ago," Father Martinez continued, then shook his head as if dismissing a foolish thought. "I'm sorry. The grief must be affecting my vision." Eleanor Benedetti. The name connected everything. After the viewing ended that night, I researched our records and found her file. Eleanor Benedetti, Father Anthony Benedetti's younger sister, had indeed passed away 12 years earlier. We had handled her arrangements, and I remembered her funeral clearly, a quiet service attended mostly by her brother and a handful of elderly friends. She had never married, had no children, and had devoted much of her later life to supporting Father Benedetti's ministry. The funeral mass proceeded normally the next day, but I found myself scanning the congregation for any sign of Eleanor. She didn't appear during the church service, but at the cemetery, as Father Benedetti's casket was being lowered, I caught a glimpse of her standing apart from the crowd. She watched the proceedings with the same quiet dignity I'd observed during the viewing, then simply faded from sight as the blessing concluded. I've reviewed those security tapes countless times since then, trying to find some logical explanation for what I witnessed. The footage is consistent. Eleanor Benedetti is clearly visible in our cameras, but completely invisible to other mourners and in any reflective surfaces. She attended her brother's viewing exactly as any devoted sister would, sitting vigil to ensure he was properly honored. What troubles me most isn't the impossibility of her presence, but the implications. Eleanor waited 12 years for her brother to join her, maintaining a connection that death couldn't break. She came to his viewing not as a ghost or spirit, but as family, fulfilling the most basic obligation, being there when it matters most. Now, whenever we have a viewing for someone who's lost a close family member, I find myself watching the security monitors more carefully. Sometimes, just at the edge of the frame, I catch glimpses of figures who don't reflect in mirrors. Mourners who sign no guest books, but whose love transcends every boundary we think we understand. The dead, I've learned, have their own ways of saying goodbye. Some prayers echo longer than others, especially when no one living speaks them. I'm Sarah Martinez, and I've been coordinating funeral services at Holy Cross Memorial Chapel for 8 years. My job involves managing the countless details that families shouldn't have to worry about during their time of grief: seating arrangements, music coordination, timing the procession, ensuring everything flows smoothly from greeting to final blessing. I take pride in creating services that honor the deceased while providing comfort to those left behind. The memorial service for Father O'Malley in December of 2023 taught me that some aspects of grief reach beyond my ability to coordinate or control. Father O'Malley had been beloved throughout our diocese for his gentle manner and dedication to social justice. At 76, he passed unexpectedly from a stroke while preparing his Sunday sermon. The parish council requested our largest chapel for his memorial service, expecting a significant turnout. We arranged seating for 300 people, with additional standing room and overflow accommodations. The service was scheduled for Saturday morning, allowing clergy from surrounding parishes to attend. I arrived early that morning to oversee final preparations. The chapel looked beautiful white lilies flanking the altar, programs arranged neatly on each pew, soft lighting, creating an atmosphere of peaceful reverence. Father O'Malley's casket was positioned at the front, surrounded by photos from his many years of service. Everything was ready for what I expected would be a packed memorial service. The first guests began arriving 30 minutes before the service. I positioned myself at the entrance to assist with seating and answer questions. The turnout was even larger than anticipated parishioners from all three churches Father O'Malley had served, fellow priests, community leaders, and families whose lives he'd touched through decades of ministry. By the time the service began, every pew was filled, with additional mourners standing along the walls. It was during the opening hymn that I first noticed the disturbance in the front left pew. This section was reserved for immediate family and close friends of Father O'Malley. His sister and her children occupied the front row, with church leadership filling the rows behind them. But the front left pew, the one directly adjacent to the family section, remained empty despite the crowded conditions. I had assumed it was being saved for late arriving VIPs, but as the service progressed, no one claimed those seats. What caught my attention wasn't the empty pew itself, but the way other mourners seemed to avoid it. Several times during the service, I watched elderly parishioners approach that section looking for seats, then hesitate and move elsewhere, even though it offered the best view of the proceedings. When I quietly asked one woman why she hadn't sat there, she looked puzzled. "I don't know," she said. "It just didn't feel right." During Father Martinez's homily, something more unsettling occurred. As he spoke about Father O'Malley's dedication to prayer, several mourners in the surrounding pews began glancing nervously toward the empty section. At first, these were subtle looks, just quick glances, the kind you might make if you heard an unexpected sound. But as the homily continued, more people began turning their heads in that direction, their expressions showing confusion and unease. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, one of Father O'Malley's longtime parishioners, was sitting in the second row. During a particularly quiet moment in the service, she leaned forward and whispered something to Father O'Malley's sister. I was close enough to hear her words. "Do you hear that? Someone's saying the rosary." Father O'Malley's sister looked toward the front left pew, then back at Mrs. Rosary. Brennan, with a troubled expression. "There's no one sitting there," she whispered back. I moved closer to investigate, positioning myself where I could observe the empty pew directly. The section appeared exactly as it had all morning, 6 feet of unoccupied bench seating, cushions undisturbed, no programs removed from the racks. But as I stood there, I began to hear what Mrs. Brennan had noticed. Faint but unmistakable, the whispered cadence of the rosary prayer was coming from that exact location. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The voice was barely audible, requiring focused attention to detect. But once I heard it, the sound was continuous throughout the remainder of the service. During hymns, the rosary continued. During readings, it never paused. Even during moments when the congregation fell completely silent, that whispered prayer maintained its steady rhythm. Most unsettling was the voice itself, elderly, female, with the slight tremor that comes with advanced age. After the service concluded and the family had processed out for the burial, I lingered in the chapel to oversee cleanup. The maintenance staff was collecting programs and straightening the pews when James, our head custodian, approached me with a concerned expression. "Miss Martinez, we found something unusual in the front section." He led me to the front left pew, the one that had remained empty throughout the service. On the seat cushion, exactly in the center of the pew, lay a worn rosary. The beads were made of dark wood, polished smooth by decades of use. with a silver crucifix showing signs of age. More significantly, the rosary was warm to the touch, as if it had just been held in someone's hands. James was certain it hadn't been there before the service began. "I checked every pew this morning," he insisted. "This one was definitely empty." I asked the family about the rosary, thinking it might have belonged to Father O'Malley or been left by a mourner. His sister examined it carefully, but didn't recognize it. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it's not Anthony's. His rosary was buried with him." We made announcements asking if anyone had lost the item, but no one claimed it. That evening, I decided to research the situation more thoroughly. Our chapel keeps detailed records of seating arrangements and special requests for all services. I discovered that the front left pew had a long history connected to Father O'Malley's ministry. For nearly 20 years, it had been the preferred seating location for Mrs. Rose Callaghan, one of his most devoted parishioners. She had attended daily Mass and never missed a Sunday service until her passing 4 years earlier. Mrs. Callaghan's obituary, which I found in our files, mentioned her particular devotion to the Rosary. She had led Rosary groups at St. Patrick's and was known throughout the parish for her commitment to prayer. The obituary also noted that Father O'Malley had officiated her funeral service and spoke movingly about her faith and dedication. The next morning, I called Mrs. Callaghan's daughter to inquire about the rosary we'd found. When I described it, she immediately recognized the item. "That's my mother's rosary," she said. "She carried it every day for 40 years, but we buried it with her, along with her prayer book." I explained where we'd found it, and she fell silent for a long moment. "My mother always sat in that front left pew," she finally said. "She told me it was the best place to hear Father O'Malley's homilies." 3 weeks later, we held another funeral service at the chapel. This time, I watched the front left pew carefully throughout the proceedings. During the rosary portion of the service, led by the deceased's family, I heard it again, that whispered echo of prayers, the voice of someone joining in the familiar cadences even though the pew remained empty. I've come to understand that Mrs. Callaghan's presence at Father O'Malley's service wasn't unusual or supernatural in any frightening sense. She was simply fulfilling a commitment that extended beyond life itself, being present for the man who had guided her spiritual journey for 2 decades. Her rosary, somehow returned from wherever such devotions go, was evidence of a bond that death couldn't break. Now, during every service, I find myself listening for those whispered prayers from the front left pew. Sometimes I hear them, sometimes I don't. But I've learned that the most profound expressions of faith and love often happen in places where no one else can see or hear them. Mrs. Callaghan's prayers continue, a reminder that some forms of devotion echo through eternity. Some footsteps follow a different rhythm than the living can keep. I'm Luis Restrepo, and I've worked night security at Eternal Peace Cemetery for 6 years. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week, patrolling 300 acres of burial grounds that date back to 1867. Most people assume cemetery security is quiet work, just watching for vandals or teenagers looking for a thrill. They're mostly right. The dead, generally speaking, are excellent neighbors. What happened during my patrols, through the clergy section, changed my understanding of who exactly I'm sharing these grounds with during those long midnight hours. The clergy section occupies the northwest corner of the cemetery, a gently sloping hill dotted with oak trees and marked by some of our most elegant headstones. Priests, deacons, and nuns from the surrounding parishes have been buried there for over a century. It's a peaceful area during daylight hours, popular with visitors who come to pay respects or simply enjoy the quiet beauty. At night, it's one of my regular stops, a 10-minute walk through the section to check for any signs of disturbance. Father Kowalski was buried there in September of 2023. He'd served at St. Thomas for 38 years before retiring, and his funeral drew hundreds of mourners. A good man, from what I heard during the graveside service. His plot was in the newer portion of the clergy section, with a traditional granite headstone and a bronze plaque noting his years of service. Nothing unusual about the burial or the immediate aftermath. My first patrol through the section after Father Kowalski's interment was on a Tuesday night in late September. The air carried that crisp hint of autumn, and a thin layer of frost was beginning to form on the grass. I followed my usual route, checking each section methodically with my flashlight, ensuring all was secure. As I walked the main path through the clergy area, I heard footsteps behind me. This wasn't particularly alarming. Sound carries strangely at night, especially in open areas like cemeteries. What I was hearing could be echoes of my own footsteps, bouncing off headstones, or small animals moving through the underbrush. But as I continued walking, the footsteps maintained a steady rhythm exactly 2 seconds behind mine. When I stopped to examine a tilted flower arrangement, the footsteps stopped. When I resumed walking, they resumed as well. I completed the patrol without incident, but made a note in my log about possible echo effects in the clergy section. Over the next several nights, the same phenomenon occurred. The footsteps were most noticeable when I walked the path between rows 12 and 15, where Father Kowalski's grave was located. They maintained that same precise timing, always 2 seconds behind, always matching my pace exactly. By the end of the first week, I'd developed a theory. The footsteps were simply an acoustic illusion caused by the arrangement of headstones and the way sound reflected off their surfaces. To test this, I began varying my route through the section, sometimes taking the main path, sometimes cutting across between rows. The footsteps followed regardless of which route I chose, always maintaining that 2-second delay. What made the situation more unsettling was the gradual realization that the footsteps had their own characteristics. While my boots made the solid, heavy sound of a living person walking on gravel and grass, these secondary footsteps were lighter, more measured. They suggested someone walking slowly and deliberately, as if they were unfamiliar with the terrain or taking care not to disturb anything. During my 3rd week of patrols, I decided to confront the situation directly. As I entered the clergy section around midnight, I called out, "If someone's out there, please identify yourself. I'm security, and I need to know who's on the grounds." No response, but the footsteps continued as I resumed walking. I tried stopping abruptly, hoping to catch whoever was following me off guard. The footsteps stopped exactly when mine did, with no sound of shuffling or adjustment that would indicate a real person trying to halt mid-stride. The mystery deepened when I began noticing other details during my patrols. Father Kowalski's headstone was always warm to the touch, even on the coldest nights. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding stone markers. I tested this by checking adjacent graves, and the temperature difference was consistent. Only Father Kowalski's marker retained any warmth hours after sunset. I mentioned this to Robert Chen, the day shift groundskeeper, during one of our brief overlaps. He listened to my description with growing interest, then shared something he'd observed during his morning rounds. "Every morning when I check that section, there are fresh footprints in the dew around Father Kowalski's grave," he said. "Single set of prints, like someone's been walking a circuit around his headstone. They're always there around dawn, but they disappear as soon as the sun dries the grass." This prompted me to pay closer attention during my patrols. Using my flashlight to examine the ground around Father Kowalski's grave, I began noticing subtle disturbances in the grass. Not full footprints, but impressions suggesting someone had been walking there recently. The pattern formed a rough circle around the headstone, as if someone were making slow laps around the gravesite. The most significant incident occurred during a particularly quiet night in October. As I approached the clergy section around 1 a.m., I heard the familiar footsteps beginning their echo pattern. But this time, I also heard something else, a low murmuring sound, like someone speaking in conversation. I stopped walking and focused on listening. The murmuring continued for several minutes, though I couldn't make out individual words. It sounded like one side of a dialogue, with pauses as if someone were waiting for responses. I approached Father Kowalski's grave directly, following the sound. As I got closer, the murmuring became clearer. It was definitely a human voice, elderly and male, speaking in what sounded like Polish. I recognized a few words from my limited knowledge of the language common terms, like dziękuję, thank you, and proszę, please. The tone was conversational, warm, as if the speaker were catching up with an old friend. When I reached the headstone, the murmuring stopped immediately. The footsteps ceased as well, leaving me standing alone in the darkness beside Father Kowalski's grave. I examined the area carefully with my flashlight, but found no evidence of another person. The grass around the headstone showed those same circular impressions I'd been noticing, but no clear footprints or signs of recent disturbance. What unsettled me most was the headstone itself. Despite the October chill, it was noticeably warm not just at the surface, but radiating heat as if someone had been leaning against it for hours. I placed my hand flat against the granite and felt a steady warmth that reminded me of body heat. The adjacent headstones were cold to the touch, exactly as they should be on a 40-degree night. I started researching Father Kowalski's background, thinking it might help explain what I was experiencing during my patrols. The parish office provided some basic information. He'd emigrated from Poland in 1953, served faithfully at St. Thomas until his retirement, and was particularly known for his evening walks through the neighborhood. Parishioners often mentioned seeing him out for his nightly constitutional, walking the same route every evening until just a few months before his death. The detail about evening walks resonated with what I'd been observing. If Father Kowalski had been a habitual night walker in life, perhaps those same instincts were continuing after death. The 2-second delay in the footsteps suggested someone walking more slowly than me, taking care with each step, exactly how an elderly man might move during a nighttime walk through unfamiliar terrain. I decided to modify my patrol routine to accommodate what seemed to be Father Kowalski's nightly walk. Instead of hurrying through the clergy section, I began walking more slowly, pausing occasionally to allow the footsteps to catch up. This change made the experience less unsettling and more like sharing a peaceful evening walk with a colleague. The footsteps continued their pattern, but the atmosphere felt companionable rather than threatening. One particularly cold November night, I tried something different. As I entered the clergy section and heard the familiar footsteps beginning, I spoke aloud, "Good evening, Father Kowalski. Lovely night for a walk." The footsteps paused for a moment, then resumed with what seemed like a slightly livelier pace. When I reached his headstone, I said, "I hope you're finding peace here." The warmth radiating from the granite felt almost like a response. My supervisor, Marcus Webb, initially expressed skepticism when I described the situation in my monthly report, but he agreed to accompany me on a patrol to observe firsthand. As we walked through the clergy section together that December night, the footsteps were particularly pronounced. Marcus heard them clearly, and his expression grew increasingly puzzled as we moved through the area. "There's definitely something following us," he admitted, "but I don't see how it's possible." When we reached Father Kowalski's grave, Marcus touched the headstone and immediately pulled his hand back. "How is it warm?" he asked. "It's 30 degrees tonight." We spent the rest of the patrol discussing possible explanations: underground heating pipes, solar heat retention, electrical issues. None of them made sense given the specific location and consistent pattern. The final piece of understanding came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, Father Kowalski's elderly sister-in-law, visited the cemetery during my shift one evening in late December. She'd driven down from Cleveland and wanted to spend some quiet time at his grave. I accompanied her to the clergy section and waited respectfully while she said her prayers. As we walked back toward the main entrance, she mentioned something that connected all my observations. "Anthony always took his evening walk at exactly 11:30, she said. "Every single night for 40 years, he'd walk the same route through the neighborhood, checking on things, making sure everything was secure. He said it helped him sleep, knowing the community was safe. The timing was perfect. My patrols through the clergy section typically began around 11:30 p.m., exactly when Father Kowalski would have started his nightly walks in life. The footsteps, the conversational murmuring, the protective circuit around his grave, all of it suggested he was continuing his evening routine, ensuring the safety and security of his final resting place. I've worked night security at Eternal Peace for 6 years now, and Father Kowalski has been my walking companion for the past 8 months. His presence isn't frightening or supernatural in any malevolent sense. It's simply the continuation of a lifelong habit that death couldn't break. He's still making his rounds, still checking that everything is secure, still taking care of his community even from beyond the grave. Some nights the footsteps are clearer than others. During storms or particularly cold weather, I barely hear them. But on quiet, clear evenings, Father Kowalski walks with me through the clergy section, maintaining that respectful, 2-second distance, sharing the companionable silence of 2 guards working the same beat. The most comforting part isn't that he's there, it's knowing that even in death, some people continue caring for others. Father Kowalski spent 40 years ensuring his community felt safe and protected. Now he's extended that same care to those of us who work the night shift at his final resting place. When people ask me about working cemetery security, I tell them it's peaceful work. What I don't mention is that sometimes on the best nights, you're not working alone. Some rituals continue long after the congregation has gone home. My name is Janet Moreau, and I've been an embalmer at Riverside Funeral Services for 14 years. In that time, I prepared over 1,000 bodies for their final viewing, treating each person with the dignity and care their families deserve. The work requires technical skill, attention to detail, and emotional resilience, qualities I've developed through years of practice. What happened while preparing Father Rodriguez in January of 2024 challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundary between life and death. Father Rodriguez had served as pastor at Our Lady of Sorrows for 23 years before his retirement. At 79, he passed quietly in the parish rectory while reading his evening prayers. The family requested a traditional Catholic wake, followed by funeral mass at his beloved church. Director Williams assigned me to handle the preparation, noting that Father Rodriguez had been particularly respected in the community and deserved our most careful attention. I began the embalming process late Tuesday evening, working in our main preparation room. Father Rodriguez appeared to be in excellent condition. Despite his age, a thin but healthy-looking man, with silver hair and hands that showed the gentle wear of someone who'd spent decades blessing others. His face held a serene expression that made the preparation work feel more like tending to someone who was simply sleeping peacefully. The embalming process proceeded normally through the first several hours. I'd completed the arterial preparation and was beginning the cavity treatment when I noticed something unusual. Father Rodriguez's lips appeared to be moving slightly, forming what looked like words. This isn't uncommon during embalming gases, and fluid pressure can cause minor facial movements. But the motion was too regular, too deliberate, to be random muscular activity. I paused my work to observe more carefully. Father Rodriguez's mouth was definitely forming specific shapes, moving through what appeared to be a familiar sequence. Having grown up Catholic myself, I recognized the pattern immediately. His lips were moving through the words of the Eucharistic prayer, the central blessing of the Catholic Mass. "Take this, all of you, and eat of it," his mouth seemed to say, though no sound accompanied the movement. Initially, I attributed this to coincidence or my own imagination. The embalming process can be emotionally challenging, and sometimes we see patterns where none exist. But as I continued working, Father Rodriguez's mouth kept moving through what appeared to be the complete sequence of communion prayers. The timing was perfect, each phrase received the appropriate pause, every blessing given its proper emphasis. By midnight, I'd completed most of the preparation work and was applying the cosmetic touches that would ensure Father Rodriguez looked peaceful for his viewing. Throughout this entire process, his lips continued their silent recitation. What made the situation more unsettling was the increasing clarity of the movements. Early in the evening, the lip motions had been subtle, barely noticeable. Now they were pronounced enough that I could follow along with the familiar prayers. I decided to test my observation. Catholic Mass follows a precise liturgical structure, and the Eucharistic prayer has specific sections that occur in the same order every time. If Father Rodriguez was genuinely reciting these prayers, his mouth movements should follow that exact sequence. I pulled up the text on my phone and watched carefully as his lips moved through each portion. The correlation was perfect. He moved through the opening blessing, the consecratory prayer, the memorial acclamation, and the concluding doxology in precise order. Each section received its proper timing and emphasis. When he reached the final Amen, there was a brief pause before he began the sequence again from the beginning. It was as if Father Rodriguez was celebrating a continuous, eternal Mass. Around 1 a.m., something more dramatic occurred. As Father Rodriguez's mouth shaped the words "Body of Christ," I heard a whispered voice speaking those exact words. The sound was barely audible, requiring complete silence to detect, but it was definitely there. His voice, speaking the blessing he'd given thousands of times during his years of ministry. I stepped back from the preparation table, my hands trembling slightly. In 14 years of embalming, I'd never experienced anything like this. Bodies don't speak, even in whispers. But there was no mistaking what I'd heard. Father Rodriguez had spoken the words of consecration with the same gentle authority he'd used in life. Over the next hour, the whispered prayers became more frequent. Every time his mouth formed the words, "Body of Christ," that same soft voice would accompany the movement. Sometimes I heard "Blood of Christ" as well, always spoken with reverent precision. The phrases corresponded exactly to moments in the Mass, when a priest would be distributing communion to his congregation. I called Director Williams, unsure how to explain what I was experiencing. "I need you to come down to the prep room," I told him. "Something unusual is happening with Father Rodriguez." Williams arrived 20 minutes later. Skeptical but concerned about my obvious distress, I positioned him where he could observe Father Rodriguez's face clearly, and we waited. Within minutes, Father Rodriguez's mouth began forming the familiar words of the Eucharistic prayer. Williams watched in fascination as the deceased priest's lips moved through the complete sequence with liturgical precision. When we reached the moment of consecration, Father Rodriguez whispered, "Body of Christ," just loudly enough for both of us to hear clearly. "How is this possible?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no answer. We stood watching Father Rodriguez continue his silent Mass, speaking the sacred words that had defined his life's work. The experience was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling, a dead man continuing to offer communion to an invisible congregation. Williams suggested we document what we were witnessing. Using his phone, he recorded several minutes of footage, showing Father Rodriguez's mouth movements and capturing the whispered words of consecration. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it clearly preserved those moments when Father Rodriguez spoke the central prayers of the Catholic Mass. We completed the preparation work, with Father Rodriguez continuing his silent celebration throughout. Even as I applied the final cosmetic touches and arranged his hands in the traditional prayer position, his mouth kept moving through the familiar liturgical sequence. The whispered words came less frequently as dawn approached, but they never stopped entirely. The viewing began Thursday morning, and I made sure to observe the family's reaction to Father Rodriguez's appearance. They seemed pleased with how peaceful he looked, commenting on the serene expression and the dignity of his presentation. None of them mentioned anything unusual about his appearance, and I saw no signs that his mouth was continuing to move during the public viewing hours. But that evening, after the mourners had gone home and the funeral home was quiet, I returned to check on Father Rodriguez one final time. In the dimly lit viewing room, I could see his lips moving again through the same prayer sequence. As I stood beside his casket, I heard him whisper, "Body of Christ," with the same gentle authority he'd shown in life. Father Martinez, who celebrated the funeral mass the next day, shared something during his homily that put Father Rodriguez's continuing prayers into perspective. Father Rodriguez once told me that saying Mass wasn't just his job, it was his identity. Father Martinez said he believed that offering communion was the most sacred act a human being could perform, and he approached it with total devotion every single day for 5 decades. After the funeral, I researched Father Rodriguez's ministry more thoroughly. Parish records showed that he'd celebrated daily Mass for 47 years without missing a single day due to illness or vacation. Even during his final weeks, when his health was declining, he insisted on saying Mass every morning at 6 a.m. The last Mass he celebrated was the morning before his death. I've prepared dozens of bodies since Father Rodriguez, but none have shown similar phenomena. What I witnessed wasn't frightening or supernatural in any threatening sense. It was simply the continuation of a devotion so profound that death couldn't interrupt it. Father Rodriguez spent nearly half a century offering communion to his community. In some sense, he's still doing exactly that. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm working alone in the preparation room, I find myself listening for those whispered prayers. I never hear them, but I've come to understand that Father Rodriguez's final Mass wasn't unusual or miraculous. It was simply the natural continuation of a life spent in service to something larger than himself. The most moving part wasn't that he continued celebrating Mass after death. It was knowing that somewhere in the mystery between life and eternity, Father Rodriguez is still offering communion to anyone who needs it, speaking those sacred words with the same love and dedication he showed for 47 years. Some arrangements require no human hands to create perfection. I'm Tom Brennan, and I've worked maintenance at Sacred Heart Cemetery for 11 years. My responsibilities include groundskeeping, monument repair, and ensuring the flower arrangements throughout our grounds remain neat and respectful. It's detailed work that requires patience and an eye for aesthetics. Families trust us to maintain their loved ones' resting places with the same care they would show personally. The situation that developed in Section 9 during the spring of 2024 taught me that sometimes the most beautiful tributes come from sources we can't explain or control. Section 9 occupies the eastern slope of our cemetery, a gently rolling area shaded by mature oak trees. It's been designated for clergy burials since 1947 and currently holds the remains of 32 priests, deacons, and religious sisters from the surrounding diocese. The section is popular with visitors not just for its spiritual significance, but for its natural beauty and peaceful atmosphere. Families often comment on how serene their loved ones look in this particular area. Each grave in Section 9 receives fresh flowers weekly, either brought by family members or maintained through our perpetual care program. Part of my routine involves checking these arrangements every morning, replacing wilted flowers, adjusting displays that have been disturbed by weather or animals, and ensuring each grave maintains the dignified appearance families expect. It's meticulous work, but I take pride in creating small moments of beauty that honor the deceased. The unusual activity began in late March, following a particularly difficult week when storms had scattered flower arrangements throughout the cemetery. I'd spent 3 days reorganizing and replanting displays across all sections, including extensive work in Section 9, where wind had knocked over several large arrangements. By Thursday evening, every grave looked perfect, flowers properly arranged, colors balanced, each display appropriately sized for its location. Friday morning's inspection revealed something extraordinary. Every flower arrangement in Section 9 had been reorganized overnight into perfect crucifix patterns. Not disturbed or scattered, but carefully rearranged so the flowers formed precise crosses. Red roses created the vertical elements, white lilies the horizontal arms. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each crucifix perfectly proportioned, the color coordination flawless. My first assumption was that someone had visited during the night to honor the clergy buried there. Perhaps a group from one of the parishes had organized a special memorial project. But the security logs showed no unauthorized entry, and the work would have required hours to complete. The arrangements were too elaborate and numerous to be the work of casual visitors. I photographed each display and reported the situation to Margaret Hayes, our cemetery director. She was as puzzled as I was, but agreed the arrangements were beautiful and shouldn't be disturbed. If someone wants to honor our clergy this way, we should respect their effort, she said. We decided to monitor the situation and see if it continued. The next morning brought the same result. Every flower arrangement in Section 9 had been reformed into crucifixes, even though I'd returned them to traditional displays the previous afternoon. The work was even more elaborate. This time, some arrangements incorporated multiple flower types to create detailed designs with varying heights and textures. The level of artistry was beyond anything I'd seen in my 11 years of cemetery work. Over the following week, the pattern continued with increasing sophistication. The mysterious arranger began incorporating seasonal elements, early spring bulbs, flowering branches, even carefully placed stones to create more complex religious symbols. Each morning revealed new innovations, while maintaining the consistent crucifix theme. The work was always completed between midnight and dawn, always in Section 9 exclusively. I decided to investigate more systematically. Our security cameras cover the main entrances and roadways, but don't monitor individual sections closely enough to capture detailed activity. I requested permission to install a trail camera focused specifically on Section 9 to document whoever was creating these arrangements. The camera captured nothing. 3 nights of footage showed the normal progression of darkness to dawn, with the occasional rabbit or raccoon crossing the frame. But each morning, the flower arrangements had been reorganized into new crucifix patterns. The camera somehow missed the hours of detailed work that would have been required to create such elaborate displays. Margaret suggested we vary our approach. Instead of returning the arrangements to traditional patterns each afternoon, we decided to leave them undisturbed and see what happened. The next morning revealed that the mysterious arranger had enhanced the existing crucifixes, adding new elements and refining the designs. It was as if someone were treating Section 9 as an ongoing artistic project, building on previous work to create increasingly beautiful displays. The situation attracted attention from the diocese. Father Williams, who oversees cemetery affairs for the Catholic Church, visited to observe the arrangements firsthand. His reaction was immediate and emotional. "These are extraordinary," he said, walking slowly between the graves. "Whoever is doing this understands the spiritual significance of their work. These aren't just flower arrangements, they're prayers expressed in living color." Father Williams spent an hour examining each display, noting the careful attention to liturgical symbolism. The colors followed proper Catholic traditions, the proportions reflected classical religious art, and the overall effect created a sense of sacred space that enhanced the natural beauty of Section 9. "This is someone with deep faith and artistic training," he concluded. Word of the arrangement spread throughout the local Catholic community. Families began visiting Section 9 specifically to see the displays, and several parishioners mentioned feeling a special sense of peace while walking through that area. The arrangements had transformed Section 9 from a simple burial ground into something approaching an outdoor cathedral. I started paying closer attention to the specific details of each night's work. The arranger showed clear preferences. Red roses and white lilies were favored, but yellow flowers were occasionally incorporated for feast days or special occasions. The arrangements always respected the individual character of each grave, while contributing to the overall artistic vision. No 2 crucifixes were identical, yet they worked together as a unified whole. The most remarkable night occurred in early May, on the anniversary of Father Mendoza's death. Father Mendoza had been buried in Section 9 5 years earlier, after serving 43 years at St. Anthony's Parish. That morning, his grave displayed the most elaborate arrangement, yet a large crucifix made entirely of red roses, surrounded by smaller crosses of white and yellow flowers. The design was stunning in its complexity and beauty. Mrs. Mendoza, who visited her husband's grave that afternoon, broke down in tears when she saw the display. "Miguel loved roses," she told me. "He grew them in the parish garden for 30 years. This is exactly how he would have arranged them." She spent over an hour sitting beside the grave, clearly moved by the unexpected tribute to her husband's memory. That evening, I made a decision that had been building for weeks. Instead of leaving Section 9 after my regular duties, I positioned myself in the maintenance building, where I could observe the area through a window. If someone was creating these arrangements, I wanted to witness their work firsthand and thank them for bringing such beauty to our cemetery. I waited until after midnight, watching Section 9 carefully in the moonlight. The area appeared completely peaceful. No movement, no lights, no indication of human activity. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something subtle. The flower arrangements seemed to be shifting slightly, as if being moved by gentle hands, but there was no one there. Over the next hour, I watched the impossible. The flowers moved themselves, lifting and repositioning to form the familiar crucifix patterns. Red roses separated from mixed arrangements and joined others to create vertical lines. White lilies moved with purpose to form horizontal elements. The process was slow and deliberate, each flower finding its proper place in the emerging design. No hands touched the flowers. No figure moved through the darkness. The arrangements simply reformed themselves, guided by an intelligence and artistic vision I couldn't see, but could clearly observe in the results. By dawn, Section 9 displayed another day's worth of perfect crucifixes, created by forces I couldn't explain or understand. I've continued working at Sacred Heart Cemetery, and the arrangements in Section 9 continue appearing each morning. The diocese has declared the area a special place of pilgrimage, and visitors come from surrounding states to see the mysterious displays. Some call it miraculous, others simply beautiful. I call it proof that love and devotion can express themselves in ways beyond our understanding. The priests buried in Section 9 spent their lives creating beauty through their ministry, offering comfort, celebrating sacred rituals, bringing meaning to difficult moments. Now, in some way I can't comprehend, that same spirit of service continues through flowers arranged by invisible hands into symbols of eternal hope. Every morning when I arrive at work, I walk through Section 9 to see what new beauty has been created during the night. The arrangements never fail to inspire, and I've come to understand that my role isn't to explain the mystery, but simply to appreciate the gift of working in a place where such impossible beauty can flourish. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, even after death. My name is Director Chen, and I've been managing funeral services at Mercy Memorial Home for 16 years. During that time, I've learned that grief manifests in countless ways: tears and laughter, silence and stories, anger and acceptance. What remains constant is the human need to connect with the deceased, to share final words or seek closure for unfinished business. Father Sullivan's wake in February of 2024 showed me that sometimes the deepest connections happen when mourners believe they're speaking to someone who can still hear and respond. Father Sullivan had served as pastor at St. Michael's for 31 years, earning a reputation for his compassionate approach to confession and spiritual counseling. He was particularly known for his patience with troubled parishioners and his ability to help people find peace with their past mistakes. His death at 77 from complications following surgery was unexpected, and the community's grief was profound and widespread. The family requested a 3-day viewing period to accommodate the large number of people who wanted to pay their respects. We arranged our largest viewing room with Father Sullivan's casket positioned at the front, surrounded by flowers and photos celebrating his life of service. The first day drew over 200 visitors, including many parishioners who clearly had deep personal connections to the deceased priest. It was during the evening session of the first day that I noticed an unusual pattern in how mourners were interacting with Father Sullivan's casket. Instead of the typical brief visit, a moment of prayer, perhaps touching the casket, sharing a memory with family members, many visitors were spending extended time speaking directly to Father Sullivan in hushed, private tones. These weren't casual conversations or shared memories, but intense, emotional exchanges. Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez was the first person I observed having what appeared to be a deeply personal conversation with the deceased priest. She stood beside his casket for nearly 20 minutes, speaking in whispered Spanish, occasionally pausing as if waiting for a response. Her body language suggested she was unburdening herself of something heavy, shoulders relaxed, hands gesturing expressively, tears flowing freely, but without distress. When Mrs. Gonzalez finally stepped away from the casket, her entire demeanor had changed. She looked peaceful in a way that grief counselors recognize the relief that comes after finally expressing something that's been weighing on the heart. As she signed our guest book, she mentioned to me, "Father Sullivan always knew exactly what to say. Even now, he's still helping people find peace." Throughout the evening, similar scenes repeated with different mourners. A middle-aged man spoke intensely to Father Sullivan for 15 minutes, occasionally nodding as if receiving responses. A young woman brought her teenage son to the casket, and both of them seemed to be having a serious conversation with the deceased priest. Each person left appearing lighter, more at peace than when they'd arrived. What made these interactions particularly unusual was the way mourners paused during their conversations, creating space for responses that never came audibly, but seemed to be received nonetheless. People would ask questions, wait, then nod or react as if they'd heard answers. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. On the second day of viewing, the phenomenon intensified. Word seemed to have spread through the parish that Father Sullivan was somehow still available for the kind of spiritual counseling he'd provided in life. People arrived with obvious emotional burdens, spoke privately with him, and left visibly transformed. The viewing room began to feel less like a funeral and more like an active confessional. I positioned myself where I could observe these interactions more closely. What I witnessed challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between life and death. Mourners weren't just talking to Father Sullivan, they were having genuine conversations with him, complete with pauses, responses, and the kind of emotional resolution that comes from effective pastoral counseling. Mr. James McCarthy, a parishioner I recognize from previous funerals, exemplified what was happening. He approached Father Sullivan's casket carrying obvious emotional weight, his face drawn with what appeared to be years of guilt or regret. He spoke quietly but intensely for nearly half an hour, sometimes appearing to listen carefully to responses only he could hear. During one particular moment, Mr. McCarthy's face brightened noticeably, and he said loudly enough for me to hear, "Really, Father? After all these years, you forgive me?" He stood silently for several minutes, tears streaming down his face, then said, "Thank you. I've been carrying this for 23 years, and I never thought." He left the funeral home looking like a different person entirely. The most remarkable incident occurred when Mrs. Elena Vasquez brought her adult daughter Maria to the viewing. Maria had been estranged from the Catholic Church for over a decade, following a painful divorce that the Church hadn't recognized. She approached Father Sullivan's casket reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable in the religious environment. What followed was an extraordinary transformation. Maria began speaking haltingly to Father Sullivan, her voice filled with old anger and hurt. As she continued talking, her tone gradually shifted from accusatory to questioning to finally seeking. She spent 45 minutes beside his casket, occasionally laughing through tears, sometimes appearing startled by whatever she was hearing in response. When Maria finally stepped away, she immediately sought out Father Martinez, who was present to support the family. "Father, I want to come back to the church," she said. Father Sullivan explained things to me in a way that finally makes sense. "I understand now that my divorce doesn't make me less worthy of God's love." Father Martinez looked confused, since Father Sullivan was obviously unable to speak, but he welcomed Maria's decision warmly. By the third day, people were arriving specifically to have these private conversations with Father Sullivan. The viewing had evolved into something unprecedented in my experience, a functioning confessional operated by a deceased priest who somehow retained the ability to provide spiritual counseling to his parishioners. I documented several of these interactions, both for my own understanding and to share with the family. The pattern was remarkably consistent. People arrived carrying obvious emotional burdens, spent extended time in private conversation with Father Sullivan, and left appearing spiritually refreshed and at peace. Many reported hearing his voice offering specific advice, forgiveness, or comfort. Father Martinez, who was preparing to celebrate the funeral mass, was initially skeptical of what I described. But after observing the interactions himself, he began to see them as a profound expression of faith, rather than anything supernatural or concerning. Father Sullivan spent 31 years helping people find peace with God and themselves, he told me. Perhaps death hasn't ended that ministry. It's simply taken a different form. The funeral mass itself was extraordinary. Nearly every person who had engaged in those private conversations with Father Sullivan during the viewing spoke during the sharing of memories. Their testimonies weren't about his past accomplishments, but about current conversations, how he'd helped them resolve guilt, find forgiveness, or make peace with long-standing spiritual struggles. Mrs. Gonzalez stood to share how Father Sullivan had helped her forgive herself for missing her mother's death. Mr. McCarthy spoke about receiving absolution for a mistake that had haunted him for decades. Maria testified about finding her way back to faith after years of feeling rejected by the church. Each testimony described recent, specific guidance that had come directly from conversations with Father Sullivan during the viewing. After the funeral, I found myself reflecting on what I'd witnessed over those 3 days. In 16 years of managing funeral services, I'd never seen anything comparable. Father Sullivan had somehow remained available to his parishioners in their time of need, continuing the ministry that had defined his life, even after death. The most powerful moment came at the very end, just before we closed the casket for burial. An elderly woman approached Father Sullivan for what would be the final private conversation. She spoke quietly for several minutes, then placed her hand on his folded hands and said clearly, "Thank you, Father. Go in peace. You've done enough for all of us." For the first time during the entire viewing period, there was no sense of ongoing conversation, no feeling that Father Sullivan was still actively listening and responding. The woman's blessing seemed to have released him from whatever obligation had kept him available to his congregation during those 3 days. Now, whenever we have viewings for other clergy members, I find myself watching to see if similar interactions occur. They don't. Father Sullivan's ability to continue his ministry after death was unique, a final gift to parishioners who still needed his guidance and compassion. What I learned from Father Sullivan's wake is that love, service, and spiritual connection can transcend even death when the need is genuine and the commitment runs deep enough. For 3 days, he continued doing exactly what he'd done for 31 years, helping people find peace, offering forgiveness, and reminding souls that they are worthy of love and redemption. Some calls to prayer echo beyond the reach of human hands. I'm Mike Castellano, and I've supervised cemetery operations at Holy Redeemer Memorial Gardens for 19 years. My responsibilities include maintaining our historic chapel, managing burial schedules, and coordinating with local parishes for funeral services. The chapel dates back to 1892 and features a traditional bell tower that once called the faithful to daily prayers. What happened after Father Antonelli's burial in March of 2024 reminded me that some traditions carry more weight than architectural preservation. Father Antonelli had been a fixture in our community for over 4 decades, serving as pastor at 3 different parishes before his retirement. Even in his final years, he maintained the old tradition of morning prayers, arriving at St. Catherine's every day at 6 a.m. for private meditation and Mass preparation. His death at 83 was peaceful, but the loss was felt deeply throughout the diocese. The family chose burial in our chapel's cemetery section, a peaceful area surrounding the old stone building where Father Antonelli had celebrated countless funeral masses over the years. The service was beautiful. Nearly 300 mourners gathered to honor a priest who had touched so many lives through his quiet devotion and faithful service. Our chapel bell tower houses a bronze bell cast in 1895, originally used to call parishioners to daily services. The bell mechanism was disconnected in 1978, when the chapel transitioned from active parish use to funeral services only. The rope and pulley system were removed for safety reasons, leaving the bell permanently silent. The tower itself was sealed to prevent unauthorized access and potential accidents. Father Antonelli was buried on a Thursday in late March. The service concluded around noon, and by evening, the cemetery had returned to its usual peaceful quiet. I completed my final rounds that day around 5:30 p.m., checking the chapel doors and ensuring the grounds were secure for the night. Everything appeared normal. The bell tower sealed and silent, as it had been for over 4 decades. Friday morning at exactly 6 a.m., I was startled awake by the sound of our chapel bell ringing. Not the electronic chimes we use for scheduled services, but the deep, resonant tone of the original bronze bell. The sound carried clearly across the cemetery grounds and into the surrounding neighborhood, announcing the start of morning prayers just as it had for nearly a century. My first thought was that someone had broken into the bell tower, though I couldn't imagine how they'd managed to reconnect the mechanism or access the sealed space. I drove to the cemetery immediately, arriving just as the bell completed its traditional sequence 12 measured tolls, announcing 6 a.m. prayers, followed by the shorter sequence that marked the beginning of morning Mass. The chapel appeared exactly as I'd left it the previous evening. All doors were locked and showed no signs of forced entry. The bell tower entrance, sealed with both a steel door and concrete barriers, remained undisturbed. There was no way anyone could have accessed the bell mechanism, yet I'd clearly heard it ringing with the same timing and patterns Father Antonelli would have known from his decades of ministry. I called our maintenance contractor, explaining that we needed an emergency inspection of the bell tower. Despite my insistence that the system was disconnected, something had obviously malfunctioned to cause the early morning ringing. The contractor arrived within 2 hours and spent the morning examining every aspect of the tower structure. His findings were definitive. The bell rope had been removed decades ago, the pulley system was disconnected and partially dismantled, and there was no mechanism by which the bell could ring. Even more puzzling, the bronze bell showed clear signs of recent movement, fresh scratches where the clapper had struck metal, and vibration patterns in the accumulated dust that indicated very recent activity. Someone rang this bell this morning, the contractor told me, but there's no way they could have done it using any of the existing equipment. They'd have had to climb up inside the tower and strike it manually, but your steel barriers make that impossible. Saturday morning brought the same phenomenon. At exactly 6 a.m., the chapel bell began its traditional sequence, calling faithful parishioners to morning prayers, just as it had throughout Father Antonelli's active ministry. The sound was identical to Friday's ringing. The same rhythm, the same tonal quality, the same sense of sacred purpose that had marked decades of daily worship. By Sunday morning, word had spread throughout the parish community. Despite the early hour, nearly 50 people gathered in our chapel parking lot at 5:55 a.m. to witness the phenomenon. At precisely 6 o'clock, the bell began its measured tolling. and several parishioners crossed themselves and began morning prayers on the spot. Mrs. Catherine Antonelli, Father Antonelli's sister, was among those who came to hear the bell. As the familiar sound echoed across the cemetery, she began to weep quietly. Anthony never missed morning prayers, she told me. For 42 years, he was at church every morning at 6 a.m. He always said the bell was calling not just the congregation, but reminding him of his daily commitment to God. The ringing continued every morning with absolute consistency. 6 a.m. precisely, the full sequence of 12 measured tolls, followed by the shorter pattern announcing the start of Mass. Word spread beyond our immediate community, and people began arriving from surrounding parishes to witness what many considered a miraculous sign of Father Antonelli's continuing spiritual presence. Father DeMarco from St. Catherine's came to investigate the phenomenon personally. A practical man with engineering background, he was initially skeptical of supernatural explanations. But after examining the bell tower structure and witnessing the morning ringing himself, he reached a different conclusion. Father Antonelli lived his entire life by the rhythm of these daily prayers. Father DeMarco explained to the growing crowd of morning visitors, if anyone's spirit would be bound to that schedule, it would be his. This isn't supernatural in any frightening sense. It's simply the continuation of a discipline so profound that death couldn't interrupt it. The diocese became officially involved after 2 weeks of consistent morning bells. Bishop Rodriguez visited personally to assess the situation and determine the church's response. After witnessing the 6 a.m. ringing and examining the sealed bell tower, he declared the phenomenon a sign of persistent faith, rather than anything requiring investigation or concern. The morning ringing attracted daily visitors who began treating the 6 a.m. bell as a call to actual prayer. Parishioners from multiple churches started gathering in our chapel for impromptu morning services, led by whoever felt called to guide the group in prayer. The cemetery had inadvertently become an active place of worship again. I began arriving early each morning to unlock the chapel for these spontaneous services. Watching people respond to Father Antonelli's bell by gathering for prayer felt like witnessing the restoration of something sacred that had been lost. The community was coming together in exactly the way Father Antonelli would have encouraged during his lifetime. The most moving morning occurred on April 15th, the 1-month anniversary of Father Antonelli's burial. Over 100 people gathered before dawn, including clergy from 4 different parishes. As the bell began its 6 a.m. sequence, Father DeMarco led the crowd in morning prayers, followed by a Mass celebrated in the chapel with more people in attendance than the building had seen in decades. At the conclusion of that anniversary service, something changed. The bell completed its traditional sequence, but then added something new, a single, sustained toll that echoed across the cemetery with unusual resonance and seemed to carry a sense of completion or farewell. After that final bell, the morning ringing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For 3 weeks, Father Antonelli had called his community to morning prayers one final time, using the same bell that had marked his daily devotions for decades. When the response showed that his spiritual legacy would continue through the renewed prayer life of his congregation, his work was complete. The chapel bell tower remained sealed and silent now, but the 6 a.m. prayer services continue. People still gather every morning, called not by bronze bells, but by the routine Father Antonelli established during those remarkable weeks in spring. His morning prayers continue, carried forward by the community he served so faithfully. Sometimes, just before 6 a.m., I swear I can still hear the faint echo of that bell calling across the cemetery. Not the actual bronze bell that remains silent, but the spiritual echo of 42 years of faithful service, reminding anyone who listens that some commitments transcend even death. Some concerns follow us beyond the boundaries of earthly worry. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I've worked as a funeral assistant at Eternal Rest Funeral Home for 9 years. My responsibilities include preparing viewing rooms, assisting families during services, and ensuring the deceased are presented with dignity and respect throughout their time in our care. Room 33 is our smallest preparation space, typically reserved for private family viewings or when our larger rooms are occupied. What happened with Father Murphy during his stay in Room 33 taught me that some forms of caring transcend the boundary between life and death. Father Murphy had served as associate pastor at St. Luke's for 18 years before his unexpected passing from a heart attack at 64. His death shocked the parish community, as he'd appeared healthy and vital just days before. The family requested a simple viewing followed by funeral mass at his beloved church. Due to scheduling conflicts with our larger rooms, we prepared Father Murphy in Room 33 for his 2-day viewing period. I've assisted with the preparation of hundreds of bodies over my 9 years at Eternal Rest, and I'm familiar with the normal settling process that occurs after death. Bodies naturally shift slightly as tissues relax and fluids redistribute. What made Father Murphy's case unusual was the specific nature and consistency of the movements we observed throughout his viewing period. Father Murphy was initially positioned in the traditional manner, lying peacefully in his casket, head elevated slightly on a satin pillow, hands folded over his chest, face directed toward the chapel ceiling. This is standard presentation for Catholic viewings, creating an appearance of restful sleep and spiritual peace. When I checked Room 33 the morning after preparation, Father Murphy had shifted position significantly. Instead of facing upward, his head had turned toward the door of the room, as if he were watching for visitors. His peaceful expression had changed subtly, not dramatically, but enough that his face showed what appeared to be concern or attentiveness. Most unsettling, this wasn't the gradual settling I'd learned to expect. Father Murphy's position suggested he had deliberately turned to face the chapel entrance. I repositioned Father Murphy carefully, ensuring his head was properly aligned, and his expression appeared peaceful for the family's viewing. Throughout that first day, several relatives and parishioners visited Room 33 to pay their respects. Each time I checked, after visitors left, Father Murphy appeared exactly as I'd arranged him, peaceful, dignified, properly positioned for viewing. But the next morning revealed the same concerning change. Father Murphy had again turned his head toward the door, and his expression carried that same look of watchful concern. This time, I noticed additional details that made the situation more unsettling. His hands, which I'd carefully positioned in traditional prayer pose, were now positioned as if reaching towards something or someone. The gesture looked protective, almost urgent. I called Director Harrison to examine Father Murphy's condition. Harrison has 32 years of experience in funeral service and has dealt with every conceivable situation involving deceased preparation. After examining Father Murphy carefully, he confirmed that the positioning changes were unusual, but offered a practical explanation. Bodies continue to settle for several days after death, Harrison explained. Sometimes this settling can create the appearance of deliberate movement. The expression changes you're noticing are likely due to facial muscle relaxation occurring at different rates. He helped me reposition Father Murphy once again, taking extra care to secure his head position and ensure his facial presentation would remain stable. The second day of viewing brought more visitors, including several families with young children who had been particularly close to Father Murphy during his ministry. He had been known throughout St. Luke's for his work with the parish youth program and his gentle way with children who were nervous about approaching clergy. Watching these families say goodbye to their beloved priest was deeply moving. What troubled me was Father Murphy's reaction to these visits. Each time children entered Room 33, his position seemed to shift subtly toward greater attentiveness. Not dramatically, just enough that his expression appeared more focused, more concerned. When I examined him after these family visits, his hands had consistently moved into positions that suggested reaching or blessing. Mrs. Patricia Murphy, Father Murphy's sister-in-law, spent a long time in Room 33 during the afternoon viewing session. As she sat beside the casket sharing memories and prayers, I noticed Father Murphy's expression seemed to soften, becoming more peaceful than I'd seen since his arrival. When Mrs. Murphy left, she mentioned something that gave me pause. "Father Murphy looks troubled," she said. "Even in death, he seems worried about something. He always carried the weight of other people's problems, especially when it came to protecting children. I hope he's found peace." Her observation matched exactly what I'd been noticing. Father Murphy appeared to be carrying some form of concern that death hadn't resolved. That evening, after the viewing concluded, I decided to spend additional time in room 33 to observe Father Murphy more carefully. If he was indeed shifting position consistently, I wanted to document when and how these changes occurred. I positioned myself in the adjacent preparation room where I could observe through the connecting window. Around 9 p.m., something remarkable happened. The chapel's front door chimed, indicating a late visitor. Through the window, I watched a young woman enter with two small children, both appearing to be under 10 years old. They moved quietly toward room 33, and I could hear the woman explaining to the children that they were going to say goodbye to Father Murphy. As the family approached the casket, I watched Father Murphy's expression change visibly. His face, which had shown that consistent look of concern all day, transformed into the gentle, welcoming expression I'd seen in photographs from his active ministry. His head turned slightly to better face the children, and his hands shifted into what appeared to be a blessing position. The children, initially nervous about approaching the casket, seemed to relax as they got closer to Father Murphy. The older child, a girl about 8 years old, looked directly at Father Murphy's face and said, "He looks like he's smiling at us." "Mama." The younger boy reached up to touch Father Murphy's folded hands and commented, "He's warm, like when he used to hug us after Sunday school." I was close enough to observe that Father Murphy's hands were indeed warm to the touch, despite the cool temperature we maintain in all viewing rooms. More significantly, his expression had completely transformed from concern to welcome, as if he were actively greeting these children who had clearly been special to him during his ministry. The family spent about 20 minutes in room 33, with the children sharing memories of Father Murphy's kindness and the special attention he'd given them during church activities. As they prepared to leave, both children spontaneously reached up to kiss Father Murphy's forehead, a gesture that would typically make me intervene to protect the dignity of the deceased. But something extraordinary happened. As each child kissed his forehead, Father Murphy's expression shifted to one of profound peace and contentment. The look of concern that had troubled his features for 2 days completely disappeared, replaced by the serene dignity we strive to achieve in all our preparations. When the family left, Father Murphy appeared truly at rest for the first time since his arrival. The next morning, I found Father Murphy in perfect repose, head properly positioned, expression peaceful, hands folded in traditional prayer pose. Throughout the final day of viewing and the funeral service preparation, he remained stable and dignified. The troubling shifts in position and expression that had characterized his first 2 days never recurred. Director Harrison was intrigued by my observations and asked me to document the experience in detail. After reviewing my notes and examining Father Murphy's condition, he offered an interpretation that has stayed with me ever since. Father Murphy spent 18 years caring for children in his parish, Harrison said. Perhaps his concern in death was simply an extension of that same protective instinct. He needed to know they were okay before he could rest. The funeral mass was beautiful, with special tribute paid to Father Murphy's work with young people. Several teenagers spoke about how he'd helped them through difficult periods, and the children's choir sang his favorite hymns. But the most moving moment came when the same family I'd observed in room 33 shared their memories. The young mother spoke about Father Murphy's special relationship with her children, how he'd always made time for their questions and concerns, how he'd helped them feel safe and loved within the church community. Even at the very end, she said, we felt his caring presence. When we visited to say goodbye, it was like he was still watching over them, making sure they felt comfortable and protected. After the funeral, I reflected on what I'd witnessed during Father Murphy's time in room 33. His movements and expression changes weren't random settling or preparation artifacts. They were the continuation of a ministry that had defined his life. He remained alert and concerned until he could ensure that the children who mattered most to him were okay and felt his continued love and protection. Since then, I've paid closer attention to the deceased who passed through our care, particularly clergy members who spent their lives serving others. I've learned that love, protection, and concern can manifest even after death, when the bonds formed in life are strong enough and the care deep enough. Father Murphy's final gift to his parish children wasn't just the memories of his lifetime service. It was the demonstration that some forms of love and protection transcend even death. His concern in those final days wasn't troubling or supernatural. It was simply the natural extension of a heart that had spent 18 years ensuring children felt safe, loved, and valued. Now, whenever I prepare clergy members for viewing, I remember Father Murphy's example. The best among them don't simply stop caring when they die. They find ways to continue offering comfort and protection until they're certain their work is complete and those they've loved know they're still cherished. The most beautiful part of Father Murphy's story isn't that he moved after death. It's that he chose to remain present until the most vulnerable members of his congregation felt his continued love one final time. Some prayers are too important to leave unfinished. My name is Eddie Castellanos, and I've been digging graves at Blessed Sacrament Cemetery for 23 years. It's physical work that requires precision, respect, and understanding of the sacred nature of what we're doing. Every grave I dig will be someone's final resting place, and I take pride in ensuring that each burial site meets the highest standards of dignity and care. What happened during Father Walsh's burial in April of 2024 reminded me that some spiritual commitments extend beyond the boundaries of life and death. Father Walsh had served as chaplain at St. Mary's Hospital for 37 years, providing comfort to patients and families during their most difficult moments. He was particularly known for his dedication to last rites, often arriving at the hospital in the middle of the night to ensure no one died without the comfort of final sacraments. His own death at 79 was sudden, a massive stroke that left no time for the very rituals he'd provided to thousands of others. The funeral arrangements were extensive, reflecting Father Walsh's impact on the community. Over 400 people attended the Mass at St. Mary's Cathedral, and the procession to Blessed Sacrament Cemetery stretched for nearly a mile. My crew had prepared the gravesite in our clergy section, a peaceful area overlooking the valley where many beloved priests had been laid to rest. The burial service proceeded normally through most of the traditional prayers and blessings. Father Martinez conducted the graveside ceremony with appropriate dignity, reading from the Book of Common Prayer and offering comfort to Father Walsh's family and friends. The gathered mourners responded with familiar prayers, and the atmosphere carried the solemn peace that marks a life well lived and properly honored. It was during the lowering of the casket that something unusual occurred. As the funeral home staff operated the mechanical lowering device, Father Walsh's casket descended slowly into the grave while Father Martinez continued the committal prayers. About halfway down, we all heard what sounded like muffled chanting coming from inside the casket itself. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic, melodic recitation that matched the cadence of Latin prayers. Father Martinez paused mid-sentence, looking confused, and several mourners exchanged worried glances. The chanting continued as the casket settled into its final position, becoming clearer and more distinct as the surrounding noise quieted. I've worked hundreds of burials, and mechanical sounds from lowering equipment aren't unusual. Pulleys creak, cables strain, and earth sometimes shifts unexpectedly. But this was definitely human vocalization, someone reciting what sounded like liturgical prayers in a steady, reverent tone. The problem was that the sound was clearly coming from inside Father Walsh's sealed casket. Father Martinez looked to me for guidance, as the senior groundskeeper present. In 23 years, I'd never encountered anything like this situation. The family was obviously distressed, and the gathered mourners were beginning to murmur among themselves. I made the decision to halt the burial and investigate what was causing the unusual sounds. Using hand signals, I directed my crew to raise the casket back to ground level. As it ascended, the chanting became even more distinct. We could clearly hear Latin words being recited in the traditional rhythm of last rites prayers. The voice was muffled by the casket construction, but it carried the authority and familiarity of someone who'd spoken these words countless times. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, Father Walsh's sister, approached me with obvious concern. "That sounds like James," she said, referring to Father Walsh by his first name. "He's reciting the prayers for last rites. But how is that possible?" I had no answer, but the family requested that we open the casket to investigate the source of the chanting. Opening a casket during burial services is extremely unusual and requires careful consideration of family wishes and religious protocol. After consulting with Father Martinez and receiving unanimous consent from the immediate family, we decided to examine Father Walsh's condition to determine what was causing the mysterious prayers. When we opened the casket, Father Walsh appeared exactly as he had during the viewing, peaceful, dignified, properly positioned for burial. His prayer book, which had been buried with him at the family's request, was lying open beside his right hand. The book was turned to the section containing prayers for last rites, specifically the prayer for commendation of the dying. As we observed, Father Walsh's lips were moving almost imperceptibly, forming the words of the Latin prayers we'd been hearing. His voice was barely audible when the casket was opened to the air, but it was definitely him speaking the sacred words he'd recited thousands of times during his hospital ministry. The prayer book's pages fluttered slightly, as if being turned by gentle hands. Father Martinez leaned closer to listen to the specific prayers Father Walsh was reciting. "He's performing last rites," Father Martinez whispered to me. "Complete last rites, exactly as he would have done for a dying patient. But he's doing them for himself." The realization was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Father Walsh was providing himself with the spiritual comfort he'd been denied by the sudden nature of his death. We stood in respectful silence as Father Walsh continued through the complete ritual of last rites. His voice remained steady and clear, speaking the Latin prayers with the same gentle authority he'd used throughout his ministry. The prayer book's pages continued to turn at exactly the right moments, moving through the prescribed sequence of blessings and commendations. The gathered mourners, initially confused and concerned, began to understand what they were witnessing. Several people crossed themselves, and many joined Father Walsh in the familiar responses to prayers they'd heard him recite during their own family emergencies. The burial service had transformed into a final ministry performed by Father Walsh himself. The most moving moment came when Father Walsh reached the prayer of commendation. "Go forth, Christian soul, from this world, in the name of God the Father who created you." His voice carried special emphasis on these words, and several family members began weeping as they recognized the blessing he'd spoken over so many others throughout his career. After completing the full sequence of last rites prayers, Father Walsh's voice gradually faded to silence. His lips stopped moving, and the prayer book's pages settled into stillness. The peaceful expression on his face seemed even more serene, as if he'd finally achieved the spiritual preparation that his sudden death had prevented. Father Martinez asked the family if they wished to proceed with the burial. Mrs. Walsh nodded, clearly moved by what she'd witnessed. "James always said that no one should die without last rites," she said. "Now he's made sure that included himself." We respectfully closed the casket and resumed the burial service. As Father Walsh's casket was lowered for the second time, there were no unusual sounds, just the normal mechanical noises of burial equipment and the quiet prayers of mourners saying their final goodbyes. The mysterious chanting had served its purpose, providing Father Walsh with the spiritual comfort and ritual completion he'd spent 37 years offering to others. After the burial concluded and the mourners departed, I remained at the gravesite to complete the filling process. As my crew worked to restore the earth over Father Walsh's final resting place, I reflected on what we'd witnessed. Father Walsh had dedicated his life to ensuring that people facing death received proper spiritual care. In some way beyond my understanding, he'd been able to provide that same care for himself. The incident was documented in our burial records and reported to the diocese. Bishop Rodriguez visited the cemetery the following week to bless Father Walsh's completed grave and offer prayers for his continued rest. Father Walsh spent 37 years answering emergency calls to provide last rites, the bishop said. It seems fitting that his final act of ministry was ensuring his own spiritual preparation was complete. I've worked many clergy burials since Father Walsh, but none have shown similar phenomena. His ability to complete his own last rites was unique, a final demonstration of devotion to the sacraments that had defined his ministry. The prayer book buried with him was found open to the final page of the last rite service, exactly where it would be after completing the full ritual. Father Walsh's grave has become a special place of prayer for families who lost loved ones without the benefit of last rites. Many people visit to ask for his intercession, believing that someone who was able to provide final sacraments for himself might be able to help others achieve the same spiritual peace. What I learned from Father Walsh's burial is that true vocations, the deepest commitments to serving others, don't end with death. They find ways to continue, ensuring that the work of spiritual care and comfort extends beyond any earthly limitation. Father Walsh spent his final moments doing exactly what he'd done for 37 years, making sure no one faced death without the comfort of sacred prayers. The most beautiful part wasn't that he spoke after death. It was that his first concern was completing the spiritual preparation he'd provided to thousands of others. Even in death, Father Walsh remained a priest, ensuring that the sacred rituals he'd devoted his life to were properly honored and completed. Some flames burn with purposes deeper than wax and wick. My name is Director Martinez, and I've managed memorial services at Sacred Heart Funeral Home for 28 years. During that time, I've overseen thousands of wakes, each with its own traditions, customs, and meaningful details that help families honor their loved ones. Our chapel features traditional votive candles that families often light as symbols of prayer, remembrance, and ongoing spiritual connection. What happened during Father Hernandez's wake in May of 2024 taught me that some lights burn with intentions beyond human understanding. Father Hernandez had been beloved throughout our community for his work with immigrant families and his dedication to social justice. During his 26 years at Our Lady of Guadalupe, he'd helped countless families navigate difficult transitions while maintaining their faith and cultural traditions. His death at 72 from cancer was expected but deeply mourned, and his wake drew people from across the state who'd been touched by his ministry. We arranged our largest chapel for Father Hernandez's 3-day viewing, anticipating significant attendance from the multiple communities he'd served. The altar area featured a beautiful array of flowers, photographs from his ministry, and our traditional bank of votive candles, where mourners could light candles in his memory. These vigil lights provide comfort to families and create a sacred atmosphere that honors both the deceased and the ongoing power of prayer. The viewing began on Wednesday evening with a steady stream of visitors paying their respects. Families arrived carrying flowers, sharing stories, and lighting candles while offering prayers for Father Hernandez's soul. By the end of the first day, nearly half of our 48 votive candles were burning, creating a warm, peaceful glow throughout the chapel. It was during the second day that I noticed something unusual about one particular candle. located in the front row of our votive display, directly facing Father Hernandez's casket. A red glass vigil light kept relighting itself after being extinguished. Not immediately. The relighting occurred only during moments when families were sharing their most emotional memories or painful stories. Initially, I assumed this was a normal candle malfunction. Votive candles sometimes relight if the wick hasn't been properly extinguished or if hot wax creates conditions for spontaneous reignition. But the pattern was too specific and meaningful to be accidental. The candle remained peacefully lit during casual conversations, only extinguishing and relighting during moments of intense emotional sharing. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, whose family had been particularly close to Father Hernandez, was the first to notice the candle's unusual behavior. She'd approached the votive display to light a candle while sharing memories of how Father Hernandez had helped her teenage son through a difficult period involving drugs and legal troubles. As Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about her family's darkest moments, her son's arrest, their financial struggles, their fear of losing him entirely, the red vigil light began to flicker intensely. When she reached the part of her story where Father Hernandez had intervened, providing counseling and connecting them with resources, the candle's flame suddenly grew bright and steady, casting warm light across the surrounding area. "Look at that, Mrs. Rodriguez said, pointing to the candle. "It's responding to Father Hernandez's story. The light gets stronger when I talk about how he helped us." She continued sharing her memories, and the candle's flame indeed seemed to react to the emotional content of her words, flickering during difficult moments and burning bright during descriptions of hope and healing. Throughout Thursday's viewing sessions, the same pattern repeated with multiple families. The red vigil light would burn normally until someone began sharing a particularly painful or emotional memory. Then it would flicker, sometimes appearing to extinguish entirely, before relighting with renewed intensity when the story reached moments where Father Hernandez had provided comfort, guidance, or practical help. I began observing these interactions more systematically, positioning myself where I could watch both the storytellers and the responsive candle. The correlation was remarkable and consistent. The light seemed to be reacting to emotional content in exactly the way Father Hernandez himself would have responded, offering attention during pain and brightening with hope when healing or resolution was described. The most dramatic incident occurred Thursday evening, when the Morales family visited to pay their respects. They'd driven from 3 hours away specifically to honor Father Hernandez, who had officiated their daughter Carmen's quinceañera just months before her death in a car accident. The family's grief was profound and complicated by feelings of guilt and unanswered questions about why such tragedies occur. As Mrs. Morales began sharing their story, speaking through tears about Carmen's promise and the senseless nature of her death, the red vigil light started flickering more intensely than I'd observed previously. The flame appeared to be struggling, sometimes reducing to barely visible, while the family expressed their deepest pain and anger about their loss. But when Mrs. Morales reached the part of her story where Father Hernandez had helped them find meaning in their grief, how he'd helped them establish a scholarship in Carmen's memory and find ways to honor her life through service to others, the candle flame suddenly surged to nearly twice its normal height. The bright light drew the attention of everyone in the chapel, and several people gathered around the votive display to witness the phenomenon. "Father Hernandez is still listening," Mrs. Morales said, her voice filled with wonder rather than grief. "He's still helping families find light in dark places." The candle continued burning with unusual brightness throughout the remainder of their visit, casting warm light that seemed to provide actual comfort to the grieving family. By Friday, word of the responsive vigil light had spread throughout the community. People began arriving specifically to share their stories with Father Hernandez while observing the candle's reactions. The chapel became less like a traditional wake and more like an ongoing counseling session, with Father Hernandez somehow still providing the listening ear and compassionate response that had defined his ministry. Father Santos from Our Lady of Guadalupe came Friday evening to to observe the phenomenon and offer his interpretation. As a longtime colleague of Father Hernandez, he was familiar with his counseling style and his particular gift for helping people find hope in seemingly hopeless situations. Father Hernandez always said that listening was the most important part of pastoral care. Father Santos told the assembled mourners he believed that people needed to feel heard before they could begin healing. This candle seems to be continuing that ministry, responding to pain with attention and offering brightness when people find their way toward hope. The funeral mass on Saturday was beautiful, with special emphasis on Father Hernandez's gift for helping others transform their suffering into service. Multiple families shared testimonies about how his guidance had changed their lives, many referencing their experiences with the responsive vigil light during the wake, as confirmation that his ministry continued beyond death. After the funeral, I preserved the red vigil light that had shown such remarkable behavior throughout the viewing period. Rather than allowing it to burn out naturally, I carefully extinguished it and saved the remaining waxen wick as a memorial to Father Hernandez's continuing spiritual presence. The light now occupies a permanent place in our chapel, and I occasionally light it during particularly difficult funeral services when families are struggling with traumatic losses or complicated grief. Without exception, the candle continues to show the same responsive behavior, flickering during expressions of pain and burning bright when people find ways to honor their loved ones or discover meaning in their loss. I've shared Father Hernandez's story with other funeral directors, and several have reported similar phenomena with vigil lights during services for clergy members who were particularly gifted counselors or pastoral caregivers. It seems that some priests maintain their ability to provide comfort and hope, even after death, using whatever means available to continue their ministry of presence. What I learned from Father Hernandez's wake is that true pastoral care, the kind that helps people transform suffering into hope, creates connections that transcend death. The responsive vigil light wasn't miraculous in any supernatural sense. It was simply the continuation of a ministry so profound that it found ways to persist beyond earthly limitations. The most comforting aspect of Father Hernandez's continuing presence isn't that he can somehow manipulate candle flames, but that his gift for helping people find light in darkness remains available to anyone who needs it. The vigil light responds not to supernatural forces, but to the same love and compassion that defined his 26 years of service to families facing their most difficult moments. Now, whenever I see families struggling with traumatic grief or senseless loss, I remember Father Hernandez's lesson. Sometimes the most profound ministry happens not through words or actions, but simply through being present with people in their pain and helping them discover that even in the darkest moments, there are sources of light and hope waiting to be found. Some journeys toward peace require more than earthly distance. My name is Al Thompson, and I've been the head groundskeeper at St. Michael's Cemetery for 16 years. My work involves maintaining the sacred character of our grounds, ensuring graves are properly tended, headstones remain clean and aligned, and the overall appearance reflects the dignity these resting places deserve. Precision matters in cemetery work. Families trust us to preserve the exact locations where their loved ones rest. What happened with Father Thompson's grave marker challenged everything I thought I understood about the permanence of burial sites. Father Thompson had served as pastor at 3 different parishes during his 41 years of ministry, but his final 15 years were spent at St. Michael's Church, located just 2 blocks from our cemetery. He was particularly devoted to the daily celebration of Mass, arriving at the church every morning at 5:30 a.m. to prepare for the 6 o'clock service. His death at 78 was peaceful, and his burial in our clergy section seemed like a natural completion of a life spent in service to the St. Michael's community. We laid Father Thompson to rest in Plot 14C, a peaceful location in the second row of our clergy section, positioned with a clear view toward St. Michael's Church steeple. His headstone was a traditional granite marker with his name, dates of service, and a simple cross design. I personally supervised the installation, ensuring perfect alignment with the adjacent markers and proper positioning relative to the burial plot boundaries. The first indication that something unusual was occurring came during my routine morning inspection 3 days after the burial. Father Thompson's headstone had shifted approximately 2 inches toward the chapel direction, not enough to be immediately obvious, but sufficient to throw off the precise alignment I'd established. I assumed the foundation had settled unevenly and made a note to reset the marker during my afternoon maintenance rounds. That evening, I carefully repositioned Father Thompson's headstone, using my surveying tools to ensure perfect alignment with the row and proper distance from neighboring graves. I also checked the foundation for signs of settling or erosion that might explain the movement. Everything appeared solid and properly installed, with no obvious explanation for the positional shift. The next morning revealed that the headstone had moved again, this time a full 3 inches closer to the chapel. Not only had it shifted position, but it had also rotated slightly, angling more directly towards St. Michael's steeple. The movement was too significant and purposeful to be explained by natural settling or frost heave, especially given the warm May weather we'd been experiencing. I documented the headstone's position with photographs and precise measurements, creating a record of its location relative to fixed landmarks. If the marker continued moving, I wanted to establish a clear pattern that might help explain what was causing these unusual shifts. The family would be understandably concerned if Father Thompson's grave appeared to be unstable or improperly maintained. Over the following week, the pattern became unmistakable. Each morning, Father Thompson's headstone had moved incrementally closer to the chapel, always maintaining a direct angle toward the church steeple. The daily movement was consistent, approximately 2 to 3 inches per night, following a straight line toward St. Michael's Sanctuary. By the end of the first week, Father Thompson's marker had traveled nearly 15 feet from its original position. This movement had carried it out of the clergy section entirely and into the main walkway that leads from the cemetery entrance to the chapel. The headstone now stood in a location where it would be clearly visible to anyone approaching the church for services. I reported the situation to Director Walsh, explaining that either we were dealing with an unprecedented foundation problem or someone was deliberately moving Father Thompson's headstone each night. Director Walsh suggested installing a security camera to monitor the gravesite and determine the cause of these mysterious movements. The security camera footage provided no answers. 3 consecutive nights of recording showed the normal cemetery environment from dusk to dawn. Occasional wildlife, natural shadows moving with moonlight, the gradual progression from darkness to morning light. But the headstone continued moving each night, despite showing no visible cause for the movement in the recorded footage. What made the footage particularly puzzling was that the camera clearly showed Father Thompson's headstone in different positions at the beginning and end of each night's recording. The movement was definitely occurring, but the camera captured no mechanism or agency causing the changes. The marker simply appeared in a new location each morning, as if it had transported itself during the hours of darkness. Mrs. Dorothy Thompson, Father Thompson's elderly sister, visited the cemetery during the second week to check on her brother's grave. When I explained the unusual movement pattern, she listened with growing interest rather than concern. "That sounds exactly like something James would do," she said, referring to Father Thompson by his first name. "James walked to church every single morning for 15 years, Mrs. Thompson continued. "He lived in the rectory until his retirement, then moved to an apartment specifically chosen because it was close enough to walk to St. Michael's for daily mass. Even when his health was failing, he insisted on making that walk every morning at 5:30. It was the most important part of his day." Her explanation put Father Thompson's headstone movement into a completely different perspective. If he had indeed maintained a daily walking routine to St. Michael's for 15 years, Perhaps the movement of his grave marker was simply a continuation of that same spiritual discipline. The headstone was following the exact path Father Thompson would have taken from the cemetery to the church sanctuary. I began tracking the headstone's progress more carefully, mapping its nightly movements against the most direct walking route from the clergy section to St. Michael's front entrance. The correlation was perfect. Father Thompson's marker was retracing his daily walk to morning mass, moving incrementally each night along the same path he'd followed for 15 years. The implications were both beautiful and unsettling. Father Thompson appeared to be continuing his morning routine after death, though at a much slower pace than he'd maintained in life. At the current rate of movement, his headstone would reach St. Michael's front steps in approximately 2 weeks, exactly the amount of time needed for a spiritual journey that had defined the final years of his ministry. Director Walsh contacted Father Martinez at St. Michael's to explain the situation and seek guidance about how to handle Father Thompson's apparent pilgrimage. Father Martinez was fascinated rather than concerned, seeing the movement as a powerful symbol of Father Thompson's dedication to daily worship. Father Thompson never missed morning mass, Father Martinez told us. Even during his final illness, he insisted on attending daily services until just 3 days before his death. If his grave marker is moving toward the church, perhaps he's simply completing the journey that death interrupted. We decided to allow Father Thompson's pilgrimage to continue, monitoring the movement, but not attempting to prevent it. Each morning, I documented the headstone's new position and estimated how many days remained before it would reach its apparent destination at St. Michael's entrance. The movement attracted attention from parishioners and visitors who began following Father Thompson's progress with interest and affection. Some people started referring to the moving headstone as Father Thompson's final walk to Mass, and several families made special trips to the cemetery to witness the phenomenon. 2 weeks after the movement began, Father Thompson's headstone reached the steps of St. Michael's Church. The marker settled into position directly facing the sanctuary door, aligned perfectly with the entrance Father Thompson had used for 15 years of daily Mass attendance. That morning, for the first time since his burial, the headstone showed no further movement. Father Martinez celebrated a special memorial Mass that Sunday, with Father Thompson's headstone serving as an unofficial memorial positioned at the church entrance. During his homily, Father Martinez spoke about Father Thompson's dedication to daily worship and the powerful symbol of his grave marker, completing one final journey to the place that had been central to his spiritual life. Father Thompson spent 15 years walking from his home to this church every morning for Mass, Father Martinez said. His final walk took longer than usual, but he made it here for one last time. His headstone now marks the entrance to the sanctuary, where he celebrated thousands of Masses and found the spiritual sustenance that defined his ministry. The diocese ultimately decided to leave Father Thompson's headstone in its final position, rather than returning it to the clergy section. A small plaque was installed, explaining the unusual journey and celebrating Father Thompson's devotion to daily worship. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for people who appreciate the power of persistent faith and spiritual discipline. I continue working as groundskeeper at St. Michael's Cemetery, but I've gained a deeper appreciation for the connections between the living and the dead. Father Thompson's journey taught me that some spiritual commitments are so profound they find ways to continue beyond death, crossing whatever boundaries separate the physical and spiritual worlds. The most moving aspect of Father Thompson's story isn't that his headstone moved independently, but that his final act was completing the daily journey that had given structure and meaning to his spiritual life. Even in death, he found a way to honor the discipline of morning prayer that had sustained him for 15 years. Now, whenever I see the headstone positioned at St. Michael's entrance, I'm reminded that true devotion creates pathways that extend beyond earthly limitations. Father Thompson's final pilgrimage was simply the natural completion of a journey that began every morning at 5:30 a.m. with a simple commitment to gather with God in daily worship. Some conversations continue beyond the reach of earthly telephone systems. My name is Frank Morrison, and I've worked night security at Peaceful Valley Memorial Park for 12 years. My responsibilities include monitoring our surveillance systems, conducting regular patrols, and ensuring the safety of our facilities during overnight hours. The work is generally quiet, involving routine checks and occasional responses to minor security issues. What began happening after Father Garrett's burial in June of 2024 taught me that some forms of communication transcend the boundaries we think, separate the living from the dead. Father Garrett had served as pastor at Holy Trinity Church for 29 years before his retirement. Even after stepping down from active ministry, he maintained his office at the parish and continued preparing Sunday sermons until just weeks before his death at 81. His passing was peaceful, and his funeral drew over 500 mourners who gathered to honor a priest known for his thoughtful homilies and dedication to pastoral care. Our administrative building houses the main security office, where I spend most of my overnight shifts. The building also contains our business offices, family consultation rooms, and the old telephone switchboard that connects to various departments throughout the memorial park. Most of these extensions go unused during night hours, though families occasionally call our main number for information or to report concerns about grave sites. Father Garrett was buried on a Thursday afternoon in our clergy section, a peaceful area overlooking the valley where many beloved priests have been laid to rest. The service was beautiful, and by evening, the memorial park had returned to its usual quiet atmosphere. I began my regular duties that night, conducting perimeter checks and monitoring our security cameras for any unusual activity. At exactly midnight, our main telephone line rang. This wasn't particularly unusual. Families sometimes call during overnight hours, when grief makes sleep impossible, seeking comfort or information about visiting procedures. I answered using our standard greeting, "Peaceful Valley Memorial Park. This is Frank. How may I help you?" Instead of hearing a human voice, I was greeted by the sound of someone breathing quietly and turning pages, as if they were reading from a book or document. The sounds were clear and deliberate, not random noise or electronic interference, but the unmistakable audio of someone preparing to read or speak. After about 30 seconds, the line went dead. I noted the call in my security log and returned to my routine duties. Phone calls from grief-stricken family members often involve long pauses or emotional difficulty speaking, so the unusual call didn't immediately concern me. But at exactly midnight the following night, the same thing happened again: breathing, page-turning sounds, then silence followed by a disconnected line. By the third night, I realized this was becoming a pattern. The calls came at precisely midnight, always from the same number according to our caller ID system. The number belonged to Holy Trinity Church, specifically the pastor's office where Father Garrett had worked for 3 decades. But Holy Trinity's offices were closed at midnight, and Father Garrett had obviously been buried 3 days earlier. I called Holy Trinity the next morning to report the unusual calls and verify that no one was using Father Garrett's office during overnight hours. Father Williams, the new pastor, confirmed that the building was locked and empty after evening services. He also mentioned something that made the midnight calls more significant. Father Garrett worked on his sermons every night until midnight, Father Williams told me. He'd sit in his office reading scripture, preparing his thoughts, and writing notes for Sunday services. It was his routine. For 29 years he'd work until exactly midnight, then go home. The sound you're describing matches exactly what I'd hear when I passed his office during evening work. This information put the midnight calls into a completely different perspective. If Father Garrett had maintained a 30-year routine of working in his office until midnight, perhaps the phone calls were simply a continuation of that same spiritual discipline. The breathing and page-turning sounds suggested someone preparing sermon materials, exactly as Father Garrett had done throughout his ministry. Over the following weeks, the midnight calls continued with absolute consistency. Every night at exactly 12 o'clock, the phone would ring, I'd answer, and I'd hear the familiar sounds of someone breathing quietly and turning pages. The duration varied, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes several minutes, but the pattern remained the same. I began to anticipate these calls and started listening more carefully to the background sounds. Beyond the breathing and page turning, I could occasionally hear what sounded like pen scratching on paper, as if someone were taking notes or writing. Sometimes there were soft murmurs, barely audible, that suggested someone reading quietly to themselves. Father Williams became intrigued by my reports and asked if he could visit during one of my shifts to witness the midnight calls personally. He arrived at 11:30 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday night, and we waited together in the security office for the expected call. At exactly midnight, the phone rang. Father Williams answered, identifying himself as the current pastor of Holy Trinity Church. For several minutes, we both listened to the familiar sounds, breathing, page turning, and what was definitely someone reading in a low, murmured voice. Father Williams's expression grew increasingly moved as he recognized the audio patterns. "That's Father Garrett," he whispered to me while holding the phone so we both could hear. "I recognize his breathing patterns and the way he turns pages. He always read aloud quietly when he was preparing sermons, testing how the words sounded." The realization that we were somehow listening to Father Garrett's continued sermon preparation was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The most remarkable call occurred on a Saturday night in late June. Instead of the usual breathing and page turning, we heard Father Garrett's voice speaking clearly enough to understand. He was reading from Scripture, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, the Beatitudes. His voice carried the same gentle authority that parishioners remembered from his Sunday sermons. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," Father Garrett's voice spoke through the phone line. He continued reading the complete passage, his intonation suggesting he was practicing for Sunday delivery rather than simply reading for comprehension. When he finished the scripture reading, there was a pause, followed by the sound of pages turning and quiet murmuring as he apparently made notes. Father Williams and I listened in respectful silence as Father Garrett worked through what appeared to be a complete sermon preparation session. We heard scripture readings, page turning, writing sounds, and occasional spoken phrases as he tested different wordings or emphasis. The session lasted nearly 20 minutes before ending with the familiar sound of a disconnected phone line. The next morning, Father Williams checked the lectionary readings for that Sunday's service. The gospel reading was indeed Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, exactly the passage we'd heard Father Garrett practicing during his midnight call. He was apparently continuing to prepare sermons for Holy Trinity's Sunday services, maintaining the routine that had defined 3 decades of his ministry. Father Williams decided to incorporate Father Garrett's preparation work into that Sunday's service. During his homily, he shared the story of the midnight calls and spoke about Father Garrett's continuing dedication to sermon preparation. Several parishioners mentioned feeling Father Garrett's presence during the service, as if his spiritual guidance was still available to the congregation. The midnight calls continued throughout the summer, always following the same pattern exactly at midnight. Sounds of sermon preparation, scripture readings that matched the upcoming Sunday's lectionary, then disconnection. Father Williams began looking forward to these sessions, seeing them as opportunities to continue learning from his predecessor's approach to preaching. The final call occurred on the last Saturday in August, exactly 3 months after Father Garrett's burial. Instead of the usual sermon preparation sounds, we heard Father Garrett's voice speaking directly, as if he were addressing someone on the other end of the line. "The work is complete," he said clearly. "The congregation has good leadership, and the sermons will continue to feed their souls. My time for preparation is finished." There was a pause. Then he added, "Thank you for listening, Frank. Take care of our church." The line went dead, and we never received another midnight call from Holy Trinity's pastor's office. Father Williams and I realized that Father Garrett had been using those 3 months to ensure a smooth transition of pastoral care. By continuing his sermon preparation routine, He'd been demonstrating his ongoing concern for the congregation while also preparing spiritual guidance that could support the new pastor's ministry. I continue working night security at Peaceful Valley Memorial Park, but I've gained a deeper appreciation for the connections that persist between clergy and their congregations. Father Garrett's midnight calls weren't supernatural phenomena. They were simply the continuation of a pastoral commitment so profound that death couldn't interrupt it. The most beautiful aspect of Father Garrett's calls wasn't that he could somehow use telephone systems after death, but that his first concern remained the spiritual welfare of his congregation. Even from beyond the grave, he found ways to continue the ministry of preparation and care that had defined his 29 years of service. Now, whenever the phone rings during my midnight shifts, I remember Father Garrett's lesson. True pastoral care creates connections that transcend earthly limitations. His final calls were proof that some forms of service and dedication find ways to continue beyond death, ensuring that the work of spiritual guidance and comfort never truly ends. Some watchfulness extends beyond the boundaries of earthly duty. My name is Paul Richardson, and I've served as cemetery director at Mount Calvary Memorial Gardens for 22 years. My responsibilities include overseeing all cemetery operations, managing staff, and ensuring the sacred character of our grounds is maintained with appropriate dignity and respect. Mount Calvary spans 400 acres and houses over 30,000 burial sites, including a special clergy section where priests, deacons, and religious sisters from throughout the region have been laid to rest for over a century. The clergy section has always been one of our most peaceful areas, positioned on a gentle hillside overlooking the valley with mature oak trees providing natural shelter and beauty. Families often comment on the sense of tranquility they experience when visiting this particular section, noting that it feels more like a place of ongoing prayer than a simple burial ground. What began happening after installing motion sensors in the area taught me that some forms of pastoral care continue long after earthly ministry has ended. We installed the motion detection system in late June of 2024, following reports of nighttime visitors in the clergy section. While we welcome families who wish to visit during daylight hours, overnight activity in cemetery grounds raises security concerns and potential liability issues. The sensor system was designed to alert our security staff to any unauthorized presence and help us monitor the area more effectively. The motion sensors were positioned strategically throughout the clergy section, covering all major pathways and grave sites, while avoiding areas where natural wildlife movement might trigger false alarms. Each sensor was connected to our central monitoring system, which logs all activation times and durations while sending alerts to our overnight security staff. The first night after installation, the motion sensors activated at exactly sunset, triggering a sequence that began at the section's main entrance and progressed systematically through each row of graves. The timing was precise. Each sensor activated for approximately 2 minutes before the next one in sequence began detecting movement. The pattern suggested someone walking slowly and deliberately through the entire clergy section. I reviewed the activation logs with our security supervisor, assuming we'd captured evidence of unauthorized visitors who needed to be addressed. But when we examined the surveillance camera footage corresponding to the motion sensor alerts, we found no evidence of human presence. The cameras showed only the normal cemetery environment, empty pathways, undisturbed grave sites, and the natural shadows that accompany sunset. The discrepancy between motion sensor activation and camera footage was puzzling, but not necessarily concerning. Motion detectors can be triggered by various factors, including temperature changes, small animals, or even shifting vegetation. We decided to monitor the situation for several more nights before making any adjustments to the system's sensitivity. For the next week, the identical pattern repeated every evening. At sunset, the motion sensors would activate in the same sequence, beginning at the clergy section entrance and progressing through each row with the timing and precision of someone conducting systematic rounds. The surveillance cameras continued to show no visible cause for the sensor alerts. What made the pattern particularly intriguing was its consistency and apparent purposefulness. The movement always began at exactly sunset and followed the most logical route for someone checking on each gravesite. The timing between sensors suggested a walking pace appropriate for someone pausing briefly at each grave, exactly the kind of rounds a devoted pastor might make while visiting parishioners' final resting places. I decided to observe the phenomenon personally, positioning myself in the maintenance building where I could watch the clergy section during the evening sensor activations. As sunset approached, I focused my attention on the area where the motion sensors consistently triggered their first alerts. At exactly sunset, I observed something remarkable that the surveillance cameras had somehow failed to capture. A figure moved slowly through the clergy section, following the precise path indicated by the motion sensor activations. The figure appeared to be an elderly man in clerical clothing, walking with the careful attention of someone checking on each gravesite with pastoral concern. The figure paused at each gravestone, sometimes appearing to read inscriptions, occasionally standing in what looked like prayer or meditation. The movements were gentle and respectful, suggesting someone who belonged in that space and was fulfilling familiar duties, rather than trespassing or disturbing the peace. What was most remarkable was that while I could see this figure clearly with my own eyes, the surveillance cameras showed no corresponding image. The motion sensors were detecting actual movement by an actual presence, but that presence existed in a way that camera technology couldn't capture or record. I began researching the history of Mount Calvary's clergy section, seeking information that might explain the nightly visitations. Cemetery records showed that 37 priests, 12 deacons, and 8 religious sisters were buried in that section, representing over a century of faithful service to the surrounding community. One name appeared consistently in the records: Father Michael O'Brien, who had served as chaplain at Mount Calvary itself for 43 years before his death in 1998. During his tenure, Father O'Brien had maintained a daily routine of evening rounds through the clergy section, visiting each grave to offer prayers for his deceased colleagues and ensure their resting places remained properly tended. According to staff members who had worked with Father O'Brien, he considered these evening rounds one of his most important responsibilities. Father O'Brien felt that priests who had served faithfully during life deserved continuing pastoral care after death. One longtime groundskeeper told me he'd walk through the clergy section every evening at sunset, praying for each of his fellow priests and making sure their graves showed proper respect. This information perfectly matched the pattern our motion sensors were detecting. If Father O'Brien was somehow continuing his evening rounds 26 years after his own death, it would explain the systematic movement through the clergy section and the obvious care and attention shown to each gravesite. I shared my observations with Bishop Martinez, who oversees cemetery affairs for the diocese. Rather than expressing concern about supernatural activity, Bishop Martinez was moved by the apparent continuation of Father O'Brien's pastoral ministry. Father O'Brien was extraordinarily devoted to the care of souls, both living and deceased, the bishop said. If his spirit is continuing those evening rounds, it's a beautiful testament to the eternal nature of priestly service. The bishop visited Mount Calvary to observe the evening phenomena personally. As sunset approached, we positioned ourselves where we could watch the clergy section during the motion sensor activations. Bishop Martinez was deeply moved when he witnessed the same figure I'd been observing, recognizing both the clerical attire and the careful, respectful manner that had characterized Father O'Brien's evening rounds. "That's definitely Father O'Brien," Bishop Martinez confirmed. "I remember his commitment to visiting the clergy graves every evening. He felt it was essential that priests who had served faithfully continue to receive pastoral care after death." The bishop blessed Father O'Brien's continuing ministry and declared the evening rounds a source of comfort rather than concern. Word of Father O'Brien's evening rounds spread throughout the local Catholic community. Families with loved ones buried in the clergy section found great comfort in knowing that a devoted priest was continuing to watch over the graves and offer prayers for the deceased. Several people mentioned feeling a special sense of peace when visiting the section during daylight hours, as if it remained under active pastoral care. The motion sensor alerts continue every evening at sunset, following the same systematic pattern through the clergy section. Our security staff has learned to expect and appreciate these nightly rounds, understanding that Father O'Brien is simply continuing the ministry that defined his 43 years of service at Mount Calvary. I've had several more personal sightings of Father O'Brien during his evening rounds, always observing the same careful attention to each grave and the respectful manner that characterized his earthly ministry. His presence isn't frightening or supernatural in any threatening sense. It's simply the continuation of a pastoral commitment so profound that death couldn't interrupt it. The most beautiful aspect of Father O'Brien's continuing rounds isn't that he can somehow activate motion sensors after death, but that his first concern remains the spiritual welfare of his fellow priests. Even from beyond the grave, he continues ensuring that those who served faithfully during life receive appropriate honor and care in death. Mount Calvary's clergy section has become known throughout the region as a place where the dead receive continuing pastoral attention. Families request burial there specifically because they know Father O'Brien will be watching over their loved ones with the same dedication he showed during his 43 years of earthly ministry. Now, whenever the motion sensors activate at sunset, I'm reminded of Father O'Brien's lesson. True pastoral care creates commitments that transcend earthly limitations. His evening rounds are proof that some forms of service and watchfulness continue beyond death, ensuring that the work of spiritual care and comfort extends through eternity. The eternal flame of Father O'Brien's devotion burns not in candle wax or oil, but in the persistent love that drives him to continue his rounds each evening, checking on his fellow servants of God, and ensuring that none of them rest unattended or forgotten. His watchfulness has become our peace, and his continuing ministry has transformed Mount Calvary into a place where death marks not the end of care, but its eternal beginning.